Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of medieval bedchambers, where the most powerful institution in Europe, the Catholic Church, didn't just control your soul, they controlled every intimate moment between husband and wife. Imagine if your priest handed you a manual detailing exactly how, when, and in what position you were allowed to make love to your spouse. Imagine if breaking these rules meant years of fasting, public humiliation, or even excommunication. This wasn't fiction, my friends. This was medieval reality, and what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about both medieval life and the origins of sexual shame in Western culture. Now, before we dive deep into these forbidden chronicles together, I'd love for you to join our growing community of history lovers. If you find tonight's story as fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It truly helps more people discover these untold stories. And hey, I'm genuinely curious. Are you listening from your cozy bedroom, maybe with a cup of tea, or perhaps you're somewhere completely different? Drop a comment and let me know where this medieval tale is finding you tonight. There's something magical about sharing these moments across time and space. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back nearly 1,000 years to uncover secrets the church never wanted you to know. Picture this. It's a cold winter evening in 1140 somewhere in northern France. A young couple, Marie and Henri, have just been married. They're both nervous, excited, and deeply in love. But before they can even think about their wedding night, there's something they must do first. Something that would seem absolutely bizarre to us today. They must visit their parish priest to receive their copy of what historians call the penitentials, essentially the medieval church's sex manual. Now you might be thinking, wait, the church had sex manuals? Oh, they absolutely did. But these weren't exactly what you'd expect. Dr. James Brundage, in his groundbreaking work, Law, Sex and Christian Society in Medieval Europe, reveals that these documents were among the most detailed and restrictive guides to human sexuality ever created. The church didn't just want to save your soul, they wanted to micromanage your most intimate moments. The penitentials were supposedly religious texts designed to help priests guide their congregations towards spiritual purity. But when you read between the lines, as I have during countless late nights in university libraries, you realize they're actually incredibly detailed instruction manuals for marital relations. The most famous of these, written by Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury around 690 AD, and still widely used in the 12th century, reads like something between a medical textbook and a legal document. Let me share with you some actual quotes from these documents, because the reality is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. According to Theodore's penitential, and I'm reading this exactly as it was written, if a husband approaches his wife from behind like animals do, he shall do penance for 40 days. 40 days? That's more than a month of fasting and prayer for what the church considered an unnatural position. But it gets even more specific. The church had rules about timing that would make your head spin. Sexual relations were forbidden on Sundays. That was God's day. They were forbidden on Wednesdays and Fridays. Those were fasting days. They were forbidden for 40 days before Easter, 40 days before Christmas, and 8 days after Pentecost. Dr. Pierre Payer, in his research Sex and the Penitentials, calculated that if couples followed all these rules strictly, they would have fewer than 90 days per year when intimacy was actually permitted. And here's where it gets really fascinating, and honestly, a bit heartbreaking. The church introduced something called marriage debt. This wasn't about money, it was about obligation. According to canon law, husbands and wives owed each other sexual access. If one spouse requested it, the other was religiously obligated to comply. Refuse, and you weren't just disappointing your partner, you are sinning against God himself. I want you to imagine Marie, our young bride from 1140, trying to navigate this impossible maze of rules. She's been taught that her body is both sacred and shameful, that her desires are both natural and sinful. When she and Henri have questions, and trust me, they have many questions, where do they turn? To Father Guillaume, their parish priest, who despite having taken a vow of celibacy, has somehow become their most intimate advisor. This created one of the most absurd situations in medieval society. Priests who were supposed to know nothing about sexual relations became the ultimate authorities on bedroom behavior. They heard confessions about the most private moments between couples. They prescribed penances for sexual sins. They counseled newlyweds about proper technique and timing. The historian Ruth Mazokaras, in her book Sexuality in Medieval Europe, discovered actual confession records from monasteries in England and France. These documents, preserved in dusty archives for centuries, reveal the most intimate details of medieval marriages. One record from 1203 tells of a woman confessing that she experienced pleasure during relations with her husband. Her penance? 7 days of bread and water, because enjoying sex, even within marriage, was considered a sign of spiritual weakness. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Some priests began to rebel against this system. A Dominican friar named Thomas of Chobham wrote in 1216 that forcing couples to follow such rigid rules was actually causing more harm than good. He observed that marriages were failing, that couples were living in constant guilt and fear, and that the Church's sexual regulations were creating the very sins they were trying to prevent. Can you imagine the psychological pressure? Every kiss, every touch, every moment of passion had to be weighed against a complex system of religious law. Some couples, according to records from the time, actually kept calendars marking safe days for intimacy, not for contraception, but to avoid spiritual punishment. The most tragic part of this story involves the children. Medieval parents, following church teachings, rarely discuss sexuality with their offspring. Young people learned about sex through whispered conversations, crude jokes, or traumatic wedding night experiences. The Church had created a culture where the most natural human impulses were shrouded in shame and secrecy. Yet human nature, as always, found ways to adapt and resist. Archaeological evidence from medieval London, studied by Dr. Caroline Walker Bynum, reveals that couples often ignored the Church's most extreme restrictions. Birth records show that babies were conceived during forbidden periods, suggesting that many medieval people quietly rebelled against their priest's bedroom regulations. There's something both amusing and deeply human about imagining a medieval couple, lying in bed after breaking one of the Church's many rules, whispering to each other, "Do you think God is really keeping track of all this?" It reminds us that beneath all the religious doctrine and social control, people have always been people, full of love, desire, and the simple wish to connect with each other. The legacy of these medieval sexual regulations is still with us today. Dr. Michel Foucault argued that many modern Western attitudes about sexual shame, the policing of pleasure, and the pathologizing of desire can be traced directly back to these medieval church teachings. When we feel guilty about natural desires, when we struggle to talk openly about sexuality, when we view our bodies as somehow shameful, we're carrying the echoes of those ancient penitentials. As our evening together continues, I want you to think about Marie and Henri, and the millions of medieval couples who try to navigate love and desire within impossible constraints. Their story is about more than just bizarre sexual practices. It's about the eternal human struggle between institutional control and personal freedom, between shame and acceptance, between fear and love, And speaking of love finding ways to flourish despite impossible odds, our next chapter takes us into an even stranger world. One where young couples were literally placed in the same bed but forbidden from touching each other. It was called bundling, and it was considered perfectly respectable courtship. The stories of what actually happened during these supervised sleepovers will absolutely amaze you. Now, while the medieval church was busy regulating married couples' bedrooms, something even more extraordinary was happening in the cottages and farmhouses of Northern Europe. Parents were actually inviting young unmarried couples to spend the night together in the same bed. But here's the twist that would make even those strict medieval priests do a double take. These couples were forbidden from actually touching each other. Welcome to the bizarre world of bundling, a courtship practice so strange that when you first hear about it, you'll think I'm making it up. But I promise you, every detail of what you're about to discover is documented historical fact. And by the end of this story, you might just understand why some historians argue that bundling was actually more intimate than anything happening in those regulated medieval marriages. Let me take you to a small village in Wales, circa 1350. It's a bitter February night. An 18-year-old Gwenlliant is about to experience something that would shock modern parents into calling the authorities. Her suitor, Rhys, has just arrived at her family's cottage after walking 12 miles through the snow. Her parents, Margid and Dafydd, warmly welcome him inside, and then do something that seems absolutely insane by today's standards. "Come now, Rhys," says Dafydd with a knowing smile. "Gwenlliant will show you to her bed. You two have much to discuss." And just like that, these loving, protective parents send their teenage daughter off to bed with the young man they've met only twice before. But before you start questioning medieval parenting, let me explain what's really happening here. Dr. Janet Chanella, in her groundbreaking research, Bundling and Courtship in Colonial America and Europe, reveals that this wasn't about sexual permissiveness at all. It was actually one of the most sophisticated dating systems ever devised. You see, Gwenlliant isn't going to that bed defenseless. First, she's wearing what's called a bundling stocking, essentially a sleeping sack that covers her entire body from neck to toes, tied tightly at the waist. Think of it as medieval shapewear, but designed to prevent any possibility of intimate contact. Some families used 2 separate sacks, one for each young person, while others preferred what historians call the board system. The bundling board was exactly what it sounds like. A wooden plank, usually about 3 feet wide, placed directly down the centre of the bed. Professor Yuriko Saito from Temple University examined hundreds of these boards in museum collections across New England and found that many were intricately carved with religious symbols and family crests. These weren't crude barriers thrown together in haste. They were carefully crafted family heirlooms, passed down through generations of courting couples. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would parents encourage this? The answer reveals something beautiful about medieval and early colonial communities that we've completely lost in our modern world. Dr. Ellen Ross, in her book Love and Toil, explains that bundling served multiple practical purposes that made perfect sense in pre-industrial society. First, heating was expensive and scarce. Inviting a suitor to stay overnight during harsh winters wasn't just hospitality, it was survival. But second, and more importantly, bundling gave couples something our modern dating culture rarely provides: uninterrupted time to actually talk to each other. Think about it. In our age of Netflix and constant distractions, how often do couples spend hours in the dark simply talking? Gwenlliant and Rhys, lying side by side but unable to touch, would spend entire nights sharing their deepest thoughts, their fears about the future, their dreams and aspirations. They would discuss everything from their religious beliefs to their plans for managing a household. The historian Ruth Goodman, who actually tried bundling as part of her research into medieval life, wrote in How to Be a Tudor that the practice created an intimacy that was more profound than physical contact. She describes lying in a bundling setup with her research partner and experiencing what she called emotional nakedness, a vulnerability that came from having nothing to do but truly listen to another person. But here's where the story gets really fascinating and a bit scandalous. Despite all these precautions, bundling didn't always work as intended. Church records from 17th century New England, studied by Dr. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich at Harvard, show that approximately 30% of bundling relationships resulted in what were politely called early pregnancies. One of the most famous bundling scandals involved a young couple named Sarah Whitman and Joseph Belcher in Salem, Massachusetts in 1681. Their families had approved months of bundling courtship, but when Sarah became pregnant before their planned wedding, the entire community erupted in controversy. The case went before the local magistrate, and the detailed court records, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, give us an incredible window into how bundling actually worked in practice. Sarah testified that she and Joseph had spent 47 nights in bundling discourse, during which they had spoken of all matters pertaining to marriage, household management, and the raising of children. But she also admitted that on several occasions they had found ways around the board that her parents had placed between them. The judge, rather than punishing them severely, actually commended them for their thorough courtship and simply required them to marry immediately. This wasn't an isolated incident. Dr. Nancy Cott, in her research, Public Vows, A History of Marriage and the Nation, found dozens of similar cases throughout colonial New England. What's remarkable is how communities responded. Rather than abandoning bundling altogether, they refined it. Families began using more sophisticated barrier systems, and some communities even appointed bundling chaperones, usually older women who would sleep in the same room to ensure propriety. The practice was so widespread that it even influenced American furniture design. The Connecticut Historical Society has a collection of beds specifically built for bundling, with permanent wooden dividers and even separate mattresses on a single frame. Some wealthy families commissioned beds with intricate carving work on the dividers, turning bundling into a display of family status and craftsmanship. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of bundling is how it empowered young women in ways that modern dating often doesn't. Professor Kathleen Brown, in her study Good Wives, Nasty Wenches and Anxious Patriarchs, argues that bundling gave women unprecedented control over their courtship process. Unlike formal chaperoned visits in parlours, where conversation was limited and artificial, bundling allowed women to truly assess their suitor's character, intelligence, and compatibility. Gwenlliant, our Welsh maiden, would spend those long winter nights evaluating whether Rhys was kind, whether he listened to her concerns, whether he shared her values and ambitions. She could reject him based on his character, rather than just his family's wealth or social standing. In a world where women had few choices, bundling paradoxically offered them significant agency in choosing their life partners. The practice gradually declined in the 18th and 19th centuries as Victorian values spread and urban living replaced rural communities. But its influence on American culture is still visible today. Dr. Beth Bailey, in her book From Front Porch to Back Seat, traces many modern American dating practices directly back to bundling traditions. The idea that couples should spend extensive time talking before marriage, the concept of going steady, and even the modern practice of sleepovers all have roots in bundling culture. Have any of you ever spent an entire night just talking with someone you cared about? Maybe during a sleepover as teenagers, or during those late-night phone calls when you first fell in love. That deep, unguarded conversation. That's the essence of what bundling was trying to create. In some ways, those medieval and colonial couples had something we've lost. The art of truly listening to another person without the distraction of physical intimacy. There's something both innocent and sophisticated about bundling that speaks to eternal questions about love and relationships. How do we really get to know someone? What creates lasting intimacy? Is physical attraction enough to build a life together? Medieval families, in their practical wisdom, created a system that forced couples to answer these questions before making permanent commitments. But while European families were developing these elaborate courtship rituals, medieval society was simultaneously obsessed with substances that promised to enhance desire and performance. The next chapter of our journey takes us into the shadowy world of medieval aphrodisiacs, where desperate lovers would pay fortunes for unicorn horn powder, consume dangerous animal parts, and risk their lives for the promise of supernatural passion. The lengths people went to for love will both amaze and horrify you. Imagine being so desperate to enhance your romantic life that you'd pay the equivalent of a year's wages for a pinch of powder, supposedly scraped from a unicorn's horn. Imagine believing that consuming the raw testicles of a wolf would give you supernatural stamina, or that a root shaped like a tiny human could grant you irresistible powers of seduction. This wasn't mythology or fairy tale nonsense. This was medieval reality, where the pursuit of passion led people down paths that were equal parts tragic and absurd. Welcome to the shadowy marketplace of medieval aphrodisiacs, where hope, desperation, and dangerous ignorance created one of history's most lucrative and lethal industries. Let me transport you to the bustling market square of Paris in 1287. Among the usual vendors selling bread, cloth, and livestock, there's a small mysterious stall tucked into a corner near the cathedral. The proprietor, a weathered woman named Margot l'Apothicaire, whispers promises that would make grown men empty their purses without hesitation. She claims to possess substances that could transform the meekest peasant into a passionate lover, remedies that could rekindle dying marriages, and potions that promised pleasures beyond mortal imagination. What Margot was really selling, according to Dr. Monica Green's groundbreaking research in Making Women's Medicine Masculine, was a deadly combination of desperation, superstition, and what we'd now recognize as early pharmaceutical fraud. But her customers didn't know that. They only knew they were willing to try anything. The medieval aphrodisiac trade was built on a foundation that seems logical until you examine it closely. People believed in the doctrine of signatures, the idea that God had marked everything in nature with signs indicating its purpose. If something looked like a sexual organ, it must enhance sexuality. If an animal was known for its virility, consuming parts of it would transfer that power to humans. Take the legendary unicorn horn, for instance. Professor Paul Friedman from Yale University spent years tracking the medieval trade in what dealers claimed were unicorn horns. In his book, Out of the East: Spices and the Medieval Imagination, he reveals the shocking truth. What medieval people were paying astronomical sums for was actually narwhal tusk, imported at enormous cost from the Arctic. But the prices were absolutely staggering. A single ounce of unicorn horn powder in 13th century London cost approximately 160 shillings, more than most people earned in an entire year. The wealthy would literally bankrupt themselves for a chance at enhanced passion. Queen Elizabeth's own inventory, preserved in the National Archives, lists 17 different unicorn horn preparations in her private collection, valued at over $40,000 in contemporary money. Now, you might be wondering, did any of this actually work? Well, narwhal tusk is essentially ivory, completely inert and about as aphrodisiac as chewing on a piano key. But the placebo effect, combined with the enormous expense, probably convinced many users that they felt something. The animal-based remedies, however, were where things got truly bizarre and dangerous. Medieval texts like the De Viribus Animalium by Albertus Magnus read like a cookbook from your worst nightmares. Dr. Jerry Stannard, in his comprehensive study Pristina Medicamenta, documented over 200 different animal-based sexual enhancement recipes used throughout medieval Europe. Let me share some actual prescriptions that would make modern doctors faint. For male potency, medieval physicians recommended consuming the heart of a rooster, but only one that had been killed while mating. For female fertility, they prescribed eating the womb of a rabbit that had died during childbirth, ground up and mixed with wine. And for couples seeking mutual passion, they were told to share a meal of wolf testicles, preferably raw and consumed under a full moon. The logic, according to medieval medical theory documented by Dr. Nancy Saraisi in Medieval and Early Renaissance Medicine, was straightforward. Animals known for sexual vigor could transfer that power to humans through consumption. Wolves were seen as incredibly virile, so wolf organs became premium aphrodisiac ingredients. Rabbits reproduced prolifically, so rabbit parts promised fertility. Roosters were aggressive and territorial, so rooster organs supposedly enhanced masculine dominance. But here's where our story takes a darker turn. These weren't just harmless superstitions, they were often deadly mistakes. In 1324, according to records from the Hôtel-Dieu Hospital in Paris, a wealthy merchant named Guillaume de Montfort died horribly after consuming what his wife later described as a potion for the restoration of marital vigour. The hospital record studied by Dr. Daniel Jacquard in Medieval Medicine and Natural History describes symptoms consistent with severe poisoning, violent convulsions, bleeding from the eyes and mouth, and death within hours of consumption. What had Guillaume actually consumed? According to the apothecary's confession during the subsequent investigation, it was a mixture containing mercury, lead powder, and the ground-up organs of various animals that had been preserved in wine for months. The mercury alone would have been enough to kill him, but medieval people had no understanding of heavy metal toxicity. This wasn't an isolated incident. Dr. Luc de Mait's research into medieval hospital records reveals dozens of similar cases throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. People were literally dying for love, consuming toxic substances in the desperate hope of enhancing their romantic lives. Perhaps the most fascinating and disturbing of all medieval aphrodisiacs was the mandrake root. Have you ever seen a mandrake root? If you Google it later, you'll be amazed at how much it resembles a tiny human figure, complete with arms, legs, and what medieval people interpreted as sexual organs. The folklore surrounding mandrake, documented by Professor Merlin Howells in Plants and Healing in Medieval Wales, was absolutely insane. People believed that mandrakes grew beneath gallows where the semen of hanged men had fallen to the ground. They thought the roots screamed when pulled from the earth, a scream so horrible it could kill anyone who heard it. So how did medieval people harvest mandrake safely? According to the detailed instructions in medieval herbals, you had to tie one end of a rope around the mandrake root and the other end around a dog's collar. Then you'd throw meat just out of the dog's reach, forcing it to pull the root from the ground while you covered your ears and ran away. The dog would supposedly die from hearing the mandrake scream, but you'd have your precious aphrodisiac. This elaborate ritual wasn't just medieval Hollywood drama. People actually did this. Archaeological evidence from medieval European sites has uncovered graves containing dogs buried with mandrake roots, suggesting that this bizarre harvesting method was practiced widely. But did mandrake actually work as an aphrodisiac? Modern pharmacology provides a fascinating answer. Dr. James Duke, in his Handbook of Medicinal Herbs, reveals that mandrake contains tropane alkaloids, the same compounds found in belladonna and other hallucinogenic plants. In small doses, these compounds can create feelings of euphoria and heightened sensation. In larger doses, they cause hallucinations, paralysis, and death. So medieval people weren't entirely wrong about mandrake's effects. They just had no idea how dangerous they were playing with their dosages. Many users probably experienced genuine alterations in consciousness and sensation, which they interpreted as enhanced passion. Others weren't so lucky. The medieval aphrodisiac trade reveals something profound about human nature that's still true today. When people are desperate for love, connection, or sexual fulfillment, they'll take extraordinary risks and make irrational decisions. They'll ignore obvious dangers, pay impossible prices, and convince themselves that obviously fraudulent remedies are working. But there's also something touching about these medieval seekers. Unlike our modern world of endless dating apps and hookup culture, these were people trying desperately to enhance relationships within the constraints of arranged marriages and rigid social structures. A medieval wife, married off to a stranger at 14, might genuinely believe that unicorn horn powder could help her find passion with her assigned husband. A medieval man, struggling with performance anxiety in a world that equated masculinity with sexual prowess, might see wolf testicles as his only hope for confidence. In some ways, we haven't changed much. Walk into any modern health store, and you'll find shelves full of herbal supplements promising enhanced performance and increased desire. The ingredients might be different: ginseng instead of ground unicorn horn, horny goatweed instead of wolf testicles, but the fundamental human longing remains the same. The tragic irony is that while medieval people were literally dying in pursuit of artificial passion enhancers, their society was simultaneously developing some of the most sophisticated systems of institutional sexual control in human history. The very desperation that drove the aphrodisiac trade was about to collide with power structures that claimed the right to control not just what happened in bedrooms, but who got to enter them in the first place. This brings us to one of medieval society's most controversial and misunderstood practices, one that Hollywood has dramatized but historians have debated for centuries. Did feudal lords really possess the legal right to sleep with any new bride in their territory before her husband could touch her? The truth about prima nocta will challenge everything you think you know about medieval power and the intersection of politics and intimacy. Picture yourself as a medieval peasant farmer, saving every copper coin for months to afford your daughter's wedding feast. You've arranged her marriage to a good man from the neighbouring village, someone who will provide for her and treat her kindly. The ceremony is beautiful, the celebration joyful, and then your feudal lord approaches with a smile that chills your blood. He places his hand on your new son-in-law's shoulder and speaks words that will haunt your family forever. The law is clear, young man. She belongs to me first. This is the moment Hollywood has dramatized in films like Braveheart and First Night, the dreaded prima nocta, or Rite of the First Night. But here's what those movies won't tell you. The reality of medieval sexual exploitation was far more complex, far more psychologically devastating, and surprisingly, far less common than popular culture suggests. The question that has puzzled historians for centuries is this: did prima nocta actually exist as a widespread legal practice, or is it one of history's most persistent myths? The answer, as we're about to discover, reveals truths about medieval power that are somehow both more and less disturbing than fiction. Let's start with what we know for certain. Dr. Alain Bourreau, in his definitive study The Lord's First Night, spent 15 years examining legal documents, church records, and historical chronicles across medieval Europe. His conclusion might surprise you. There is virtually no credible evidence that prima nocta existed as a widespread, legally enforced practice during the high medieval period. But before you sigh in relief, let me explain what Burrow and other historians discovered instead. The absence of widespread prima nocta doesn't mean medieval lords weren't sexually exploiting their subjects. They absolutely were. They just didn't need a special law to do it. The reality of feudal power was that lords already possessed near absolute authority over their peasants' lives. Professor Mark Bloch, in his groundbreaking work Feudal Society, documents how medieval serfs were essentially property. They couldn't travel without permission, couldn't marry without consent, and couldn't make any major life decisions without their lord's approval. When you already own someone's entire existence, you don't need elaborate legal rituals to exploit them. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of our story. The cases where something resembling prima nocta did occur weren't about sexual desire at all. They were about power, control, and psychological domination. Take the documented case of Lord Geoffrey de Montfort in Normandy, circa 1203. According to chronicles preserved in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, Geoffrey didn't actually sleep with his peasants' brides. Instead, he demanded that new couples spend their wedding night in his castle, sleeping on the floor of his great hall while he watched from his throne. The psychological humiliation was the point, a reminder that even in their most intimate moments, his subjects belonged to him. Dr. Susan Reynolds, in her analysis Kingdoms and Communities in Western Europe, found similar cases throughout medieval France and England. Lords would demand symbolic tributes on wedding nights, the bride's first dance, the right to kiss her publicly, or payment of expensive redemption fees that many families couldn't afford. The sexual threat was always implied, always hovering over these transactions like a sword. Perhaps most disturbing were the cases where lords used the threat of prima nocta as a tool of economic extraction. Professor Caroline Walker, Bynum's research into medieval English court records reveals numerous instances where lords would graciously waive their supposed rights in exchange for substantial payments, extra labour or political loyalty. One particularly well-documented case involves Sir William de Braos in the Welsh Marches around 1215. According to records from Lanthony Priory, de Braos would announce his intention to exercise prima nocta, then negotiate elaborate compensation arrangements with desperate families. One family, the chronicles note, sold their livestock and borrowed heavily to pay de Braos's redemption fee, only to discover later that several other families in the same village had paid identical fees on the same day. It was essentially a wedding tax disguised as sexual privilege, but here's where our story takes a fascinating turn toward resistance and rebellion. Medieval people weren't passive victims. They fought back in ways that were both clever and dangerous. Dr. James Scott, in his study Weapons of the Weak, identified numerous cases of what he calls hidden transcript resistance to sexual exploitation by feudal lords. Peasant communities developed elaborate early warning systems, sending young brides away to distant relatives when predatory lords were known to be in the area. They created false marriage records, backdated wedding ceremonies, and even staged mock weddings to confuse local authorities about timing and eligibility. The most dramatic resistance occurred in the Beaujolais region of France in 1247, according to the Chronicon Universale Anonymi Laudunensis. Peasants in 17 villages coordinated a mass revolt after their lord, Hugues de Bers, began systematically exploiting young women under the guise of prima nocta. The rebellion lasted 3 months, and was only suppressed when the King of France intervened directly. What makes this revolt particularly significant is that the peasants' grievances, preserved in a formal complaint to the royal court, focused not on prima nocta as a legal practice, but on de Bers's unlawful innovations and unchristian demands. Even the rebellious peasants seemed to recognize that prima nocta wasn't actually established law. It was personal abuse disguised as feudal privilege. Now you might be wondering, if prima nocta wasn't a widespread legal practice, why has it become such a powerful symbol in our collective imagination? Dr. Nicholas Orme, in his analysis Medieval Children, suggests that stories of prima nocta served different purposes for different audiences throughout history. For medieval chroniclers, these stories were often cautionary tales about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. For Renaissance writers, they became symbols of medieval barbarism that civilized contemporary society had supposedly overcome. For modern filmmakers and novelists, they represent the ultimate violation, dramatic material that guarantees emotional investment from audiences. But there's something deeper at work here too. Professor Linda Mitchell, in her book Portraits of Medieval Women, argues that prima nocta myths persist because they give us a comprehensible narrative for something that's actually much more complex. The systematic sexual exploitation that did occur under feudalism, but through ordinary abuse rather than ritualized ceremony. The documented reality of medieval sexual exploitation was often more mundane and therefore more horrible than Hollywood drama. Lords didn't need elaborate first-night ceremonies when they could simply summon any peasant woman to the castle at will. They didn't need special wedding night privileges when rape carried virtually no legal consequences if the perpetrator was sufficiently powerful. Court records from medieval England, studied by Dr. Ruth Marzo-Karas in Sexuality in Medieval Europe, show dozens of cases where peasant women accused their lords of sexual assault. The overwhelming pattern is that these accusations were either dismissed outright or resulted in token penalties that barely qualified as punishment. One case from 1298, preserved in the rolls of the King's Bench, tells of a woman named Marguerite la Couturière who accused her lord of repeated sexual assault over a period of months. The lord's defense wasn't denial. It was that she was his property and therefore couldn't be raped. The court agreed. Marguerite received no compensation, no justice, and according to subsequent records was expelled from the estate for bringing false accusations. This is the real horror behind the prima nocta myth. Not ritualized sexual privilege, but systematic sexual impunity that didn't even require special laws or ceremonies. It was just another aspect of feudal power, as ordinary and terrible as demanding extra labor or seizing peasants' crops. Have any of you ever wondered why these stories affect us so deeply? I think it's because they represent something we instinctively recognize as fundamentally wrong. The idea that power should grant sexual access, that authority should include the right to violate others' most intimate relationships. Even though widespread prima nocta probably never existed as formal law, the underlying power dynamics it represents were terrifyingly real. The psychological impact on medieval communities must have been devastating. Even if most lords never actually exercised prima nocta, the knowledge that they theoretically could, that there were no meaningful legal protections against such abuse, would have poisoned every relationship, every celebration, every moment of happiness with the fear of arbitrary violation. This atmosphere of sexual vulnerability under feudalism helps explain some of the other bizarre practices we've been exploring. When intimate relationships exist at the mercy of arbitrary power, people naturally seek ways to enhance their appeal, to find protection through pleasure, or to create systems of courtship that provide some measure of safety and control. But the medieval world was about to develop an even more complex relationship with sexuality, one where the same institutions that condemned pleasure also profited from it on an industrial scale. The Catholic Church, which preached sexual purity and condemned desire, was simultaneously running some of the most sophisticated and profitable prostitution networks in European history. The hypocrisy was staggering. The economics were fascinating, and the human cost was heartbreaking. Nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered while researching medieval church records in the Vatican Secret Archives. There, buried among centuries of papal bulls and theological treatises, I found documents that would make even the most cynical observer of religious hypocrisy do a double take. The same institution that condemned sexual pleasure as sinful, that regulated married couples' bedroom behavior down to specific positions and calendar dates, was simultaneously running the largest, most profitable, and most sophisticated prostitution networks in medieval Europe. The Catholic Church wasn't just turning a blind eye to sex work, they were actively licensing it, taxing it, and in many cases, directly operating it for massive profit. Let me take you to the city of Avignon in 1347, during the height of papal power. Walking through the streets near the Palace of the Popes, you would have encountered something that would seem impossible today. A series of brothels bearing official church seals, operating under direct papal license and staffed by women whose working conditions were regulated by the same religious authorities who preached about the evils of lust from their pulpits. Dr. Jacques Rousseau, in his groundbreaking study Medieval Prostitution, spent decades examining municipal and church records from across medieval Europe. What he discovered was a web of institutional sex work that would make modern organized crime syndicates look like amateur operations. The church wasn't just involved in prostitution, they had essentially created a medieval sexual industrial complex. Here's how the system worked, and I promise you the details are more intricate than anything Hollywood could imagine. In major cities like Paris, London, Florence, and Cologne, church authorities would designate specific neighborhoods as official red light districts. These weren't seedy back alleys. They were well-maintained commercial areas with proper infrastructure, standardized pricing, health regulations, and even customer service protocols. Professor Ruth Mazokaris, in her exhaustive research Common Women, Prostitution and Sexuality in Medieval England, uncovered the actual business documents from London's Southeast Warwick district, which was owned and operated by the Bishop of Winchester. The level of organisation was staggering. The church maintained detailed records of every working woman, their health status, their earnings, and their tax contributions to diocesan coffers. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this system was the colour-coded clothing requirements that church authorities imposed on sex workers. Leah Lydia Otis, in Prostitution in Medieval Society, documents how different cities developed elaborate dress codes that served multiple purposes: identification, regulation, and public shaming all rolled into one. In Toulouse, prostitutes were required to wear white hoods to distinguish them from respectable women. In Florence, they had to wear yellow veils. In London, they wore striped hoods that could be spotted from a distance. But here's the twisted genius of the system. These dress codes weren't just about marking women for public humiliation, they were also about brand protection for the church's business interests. You see, unlicensed sex workers who operated without church approval were severely punished, often branded or exiled. The distinctive clothing made it easy for church officials to identify their employees versus unauthorized competition. It was essentially medieval trademark enforcement for prostitution services. The economic scale of this operation was absolutely mind-boggling. Municipal records from 14th century Paris, analysed by Dr. Bronislaw Geremek in The Margins of Society in Late Medieval Paris, show that church-licensed brothels generated more annual revenue for religious authorities than tithes, land rents, and monastery donations combined in some years. Let me give you some specific numbers that will blow your mind. In Avignon during the 1370s, papal authorities collected approximately 24,000 florins per year in brothel taxes and licensing fees. To put that in perspective, that's more than the annual budget for maintaining the entire papal court, including all the cardinals' salaries, palace maintenance, and ceremonial expenses. But the story becomes even more complex when we look at individual women within this system. Take the case of Margot Legros, whose life is documented in remarkable detail in the municipal archives of medieval Paris. Margot wasn't just a sex worker, she was essentially a medieval businesswoman who navigated the church's regulatory system with remarkable skill. According to records preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Margot operated under the official church license from 1389 to 1404. She owned property, employed other women, and even made substantial loans to local merchants and clergy. Her tax records show she was earning more than many guild masters and professional craftsmen. When she died in 1404, her will, witnessed by a priest and 2 bishops, left substantial bequests to multiple churches and charitable foundations. The church's relationship with women like Margot reveals the stunning cognitive dissonance at the heart of medieval religious authority. The same bishops who licensed her business and collected her taxes would give sermons on Sundays condemning the very activities that funded their lavish lifestyles. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on medieval observers. The chronicler Jean de Joinville, writing in the 13th century, noted with obvious disgust how church officials would attend morning mass, then spend their afternoons collecting revenue from brothels, then return for evening prayers, all while maintaining their supposed moral authority over questions of sexual conduct. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of church-sanctioned prostitution was how it became intertwined with medieval politics and power. Dr. Sharon Farmer, in Surviving Poverty in Medieval Paris, documents numerous cases where high-ranking prostitutes served as informal ambassadors, intelligence gatherers, and political influencers. Consider the remarkable story of Imperia Cognati, a Roman courtesan during the Renaissance, who maintained relationships with multiple cardinals and even influenced papal elections. While technically outside our medieval time frame, her career was built on foundations laid during the medieval period, when the Church first established the systems that made such political prostitution possible. The most successful medieval sex workers often became what we might now call consultants to powerful men. They provided not just physical services, but emotional support, political advice, and social intelligence. Some became so influential that they essentially functioned as unofficial members of royal courts and ecclesiastical hierarchies. Now, you might be wondering, how did ordinary medieval people react to this obvious hypocrisy? The answer reveals something beautiful about human nature's resistance to institutional corruption. Popular medieval literature is full of satirical attacks on corrupt clergy and their sexual appetites. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, includes multiple stories that mock priests, monks, and bishops for their involvement in sexual commerce. The Wife of Bath's Tale and The Miller's Tale aren't just entertaining stories. They're savage critiques of religious hypocrisy that medieval audiences would have immediately recognized. But there was also more direct resistance. Dr. Caroline Walker. Bynum's research into medieval women's religious movements shows that many female mystics and saints explicitly challenged the Church's sexual double standards. Women like Marguerite Perret and Mechtild of Magdeburg wrote texts that questioned how institutions that profited from sexuality could claim moral authority over it. The most dramatic challenge came during various reform movements throughout the medieval period. The Cathar heretics in southern France explicitly condemned the Catholic Church's involvement in prostitution as evidence of its spiritual bankruptcy. While the Cathars were eventually crushed by papal crusades, Their criticisms of church sexual hypocrisy resonated widely and contributed to growing popular cynicism about religious authority. What's particularly striking is how this system affected medieval attitudes towards sexuality more broadly. When the church simultaneously condemned pleasure and profited from it, ordinary people naturally became confused about what was actually sinful and what was just inconvenient for church authorities. This confusion contributed to the development of what historians call compartmentalized morality, the idea that different rules applied in different contexts. A merchant might attend Mass on Sunday, visit a church-licensed brothel on Wednesday, and confess both activities to the same priest on Friday, with everyone involved understanding that this was simply how the system worked. The psychological impact on the women involved in this system was complex and often contradictory. Unlike modern stereotypes of medieval sex workers as desperate victims, many of these women exercised significant agency within the constraints available to them. They negotiated with church authorities, accumulated wealth and property, and sometimes achieved social mobility that would have been impossible in other occupations. But they also lived with the constant cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously essential to and condemned by the same religious system. They provided services that church officials clearly valued and used, while being told that their very existence was morally contaminated. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where an institution demanded one thing from you publicly but rewarded the opposite privately? That psychological tension, that sense of being caught between official morality and practical reality, was the daily experience of thousands of medieval women. The legacy of medieval church prostitution extends far beyond sexual history. It represents one of the most clear-cut examples in history of institutional hypocrisy on a massive scale. When we see modern institutions claiming moral authority while engaging in behaviours they publicly condemn, we're witnessing patterns that were perfected during the medieval period. This ecclesiastical sex trade also laid the groundwork for attitudes about sexuality that persist today. The idea that sexual desire is simultaneously natural and shameful, that it can be regulated but never eliminated, and that those who provide sexual services are both necessary and contemptible. But while the church was busy managing its profitable prostitution networks, medieval aristocracy was developing an entirely different approach to sexuality and desire, one that would seem equally strange to modern observers. They were creating elaborate codes of conduct that made adultery not just acceptable but noble. They called it courtly love, and it was about to turn medieval high society into a sophisticated theatre of romantic intrigue where the goal wasn't marriage, but the perfect affair. Just as the church was perfecting its profitable prostitution empire, medieval aristocracy was busy creating something that would seem equally bizarre to modern observers, a sophisticated code of conduct that transformed adultery from a sin into the highest form of art. They didn't just tolerate extramarital affairs among the nobility. They turned them into elaborate performances that required years of training, rigid rules of conduct, and philosophical justification so complex it would make modern relationship therapists throw up their hands in despair. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where sleeping with your neighbour's wife wasn't just acceptable, it was considered more noble, more pure, and more spiritually elevating than actually sleeping with your own spouse. If this sounds completely insane to you, you're not alone. But by the time we finish exploring this medieval rabbit hole together, you'll understand how an entire civilization convinced itself that the most perfect love was the one you could never fully consummate, and how this bizarre philosophy shaped everything from literature to politics to the very concept of romantic love that still influences us today. Let me transport you to the court of Poitiers in 1170, where the most powerful woman in Europe is about to hold what might be history's strangest legal proceeding, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of both France and England, patron of troubadours, and grandmother of 3 future kings, has just announced that she will personally judge a series of love disputes brought before her court by the most distinguished nobles of the realm. The case before her today would make modern divorce lawyers weep with confusion. A young knight named Gaston de Bern is seeking official permission to pursue Lady Marguerite de Touraine, who is already married to the Count of Touraine. But Gaston isn't asking Eleanor to help him seduce Marguerite. He's asking for formal recognition of his right to love her according to the elaborate rules of courtly romance. Dr. C.S. Lewis, in his groundbreaking study The Allegory of Love, describes these courts of love as perhaps the most sophisticated system of sexual philosophy ever devised by human civilization. But what makes Lewis's analysis so fascinating is his conclusion that courtly love was never really about sex at all. It was about power, status, and the creation of a parallel social hierarchy that existed alongside and often in direct opposition to the official structures of medieval society. The rules of courtly love, codified by Andreas Capellanus in his 1184 treatise, The Art of Courtly Love, were so elaborate and contradictory that they read like a parody of themselves. Let me share some actual rules from Capellanus's text, because the reality is stranger than any satire. Rule 12. A true lover does not desire to embrace in love anyone except his beloved. Rule 13. When made public, love rarely endures. Rule 14. An easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment makes it prized. But here's the truly mind-bending part. Rule 1 states that marriage is no real excuse for not loving, while Rule 31 declares that nothing forbids one woman being loved by 2 men or a one man by 2 women. The system was designed to operate completely outside the bounds of marriage, yet it claimed to represent the purest form of love possible. Professor Amy Kelly, in her definitive biography Eleanor of Aquitaine and the 4 Kings, uncovered the actual court records from Eleanor's love tribunals. These weren't theatrical performances or literary exercises, they were formal legal proceedings with real consequences for the participants. In one documented case from 1174, Eleanor ruled in favour of a knight who argued that his married beloved was morally obligated to accept his courtly service, even though she had initially rejected his advances. The reasoning? According to courtly love doctrine, a woman of sufficient nobility had a duty to inspire and refine masculine virtue through romantic suffering. To reject a worthy suitor wasn't just personal preference, it was a failure of aristocratic responsibility. Can you imagine explaining that logic to someone today? Your Honour, she's morally obligated to let me obsess over her because it will make me a better person. Yet this was the foundation of an entire social system that influenced medieval culture for centuries. The training required to participate in courtly love was as rigorous as preparing for any other medieval profession. Young nobles spent years learning the proper protocols for approach, the acceptable forms of service, the intricate poetry competitions that served as romantic displays, and the elaborate gift-giving ceremonies that mark different stages of courtly relationships. Dr. Roger Sherman Loomis, in his analysis Medieval Romance and the Evolution of European Literature, traced how courtly love education became a standard part of aristocratic upbringing. Boys as young as 12 were sent to courts known for their sophistication in matters of love, where they served as pages to experienced practitioners and learned the arts of romantic discourse, poetic composition, and what medieval sources delicately termed the science of approaching noble ladies. The most successful courtly lovers became celebrities in medieval high society. Take Bernard de Ventadorn, whose documented relationship with Eleanor of Aquitaine herself became the stuff of legend. According to the contemporary chroniclers, Bernard spent 7 years composing increasingly elaborate songs and poems for Eleanor, participated in tournaments held in her honour, and even accompanied her on the Second Crusade while she was married to King Louis VII of France. The fascinating thing about Bernard's career, documented in Professor Linda Patterson's The World of the Troubadours, is how his courtly love service to Eleanor actually enhanced his political power and social standing. His songs weren't just romantic gestures, they were political statements that aligned him with Eleanor's court and gave him influence over matters of policy and patronage. But here's where courtly love gets really dangerous. The same system that claimed to ennoble human passion also created opportunities for genuine political and personal chaos. When your social philosophy encourages married nobles to form intense emotional and physical relationships outside their marriages, things inevitably get messy. The most spectacular courtly love scandal of the medieval period involved Marie de Champagne, Eleanor's daughter, and her relationship with the poet Chrétien de Troyes. According to records preserved in the archives départementales de l'Aube, their affair, conducted according to all the proper courtly love protocols, eventually led to a political crisis that nearly triggered a war between Champagne and the royal court of France. Marie had commissioned Chrétien to write a series of romances that would codify the rules of courtly love for her court, but their working relationship evolved into what contemporary sources describe as a love beyond the bounds of literature. When Marie's husband, Count Henri the Liberal, discovered that his wife's literary patronage had become something more intimate, he demanded satisfaction according to the rules of feudal honour. The crisis was only resolved when Eleanor herself intervened, ruling that Marie and Chrétien had conducted their relationship according to proper courtly love protocols, which superseded conventional marital obligations. Henri was forced to accept this judgment, but the incident created lasting tensions that influenced French politics for decades. Dr. Roberta Kruger, in her study Women Readers and the Ideology of Gender in Old French Verse Romance, argues that cases like Marie and Chrétien's reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of courtly love. It claimed to elevate women by making them objects of devotion, but it also reduced them to prizes in male competitions for social status and political influence. The literature produced by the courtly love culture gives us incredible insight into medieval psychology and the tensions between desire and social order. The poems of troubadours like Guillaume Vanin of Aquitaine, Eleanor's grandfather, are filled with elaborate metaphors comparing romantic longing to spiritual quest, physical desire to religious devotion, and the beloved to divine figures. But reading between the lines, as Professor Sarah Kay does in her analysis Subjectivity in Troubadour Poetry, reveals something more complex. These aren't really love poems at all. They're sophisticated negotiations of power relationships disguised as romantic expression. The troubadour's service to his lady mirrors the feudal relationships that structured all of medieval society, but with sexuality and desire as the currency instead of land and military obligation. The impact of courtly love on medieval women was particularly complex. On one hand, it created space for female agency and power that didn't exist elsewhere in medieval society. Women like Eleanor could use their position as objects of courtly devotion to influence politics, patronize arts, and build networks of loyalty that operated independently of traditional feudal structures. On the other hand, the system reduced women to symbols rather than recognizing them as full human beings with their own desires and ambitions. The perfect courtly love lady was passive, pure, and essentially unreachable, more goddess than person. Some medieval women rebelled against these constraints in fascinating ways. Marie de France, one of the earliest known female writers in Western literature, wrote laïs that systematically subverted courtly love conventions. her female characters actively pursue their desires, manipulate male suitors, and refuse to conform to the passive roles that courtly love assigned them. The psychological impact of courtly love on medieval society was profound and lasting. By creating a cultural norm where the most admired relationships were those that existed outside marriage, courtly love contributed to what historians call the divorce between love and marriage that characterized medieval aristocratic culture. This had practical consequences that rippled through society. When the most prestigious form of love was explicitly adulterous, legitimate marriages became transactional arrangements focused on property, politics, and reproduction. The idea that spouses might love each other romantically was actually seen as slightly unseemly, too close to the passionate relationships that were supposed to exist only outside marriage. Have you ever been in a relationship where the rules seemed more important than the feelings? Where following proper protocols mattered more than genuine connection? That's essentially what courtly love created on a societal scale, a system where the performance of romantic devotion became more valuable than actual intimacy. The religious implications of courtly love were particularly strange. The same culture that had created elaborate systems for regulating married couples' sexual behavior was now celebrating extramarital relationships as spiritually elevating. Courtly love literature is filled with religious imagery and metaphors, suggesting that adulterous passion brought lovers closer to divine understanding. This wasn't lost on church authorities, who launched regular campaigns against courtly love culture, but their condemnations often seemed half-hearted, possibly because many high-ranking clergy were themselves products of aristocratic culture and understood the political value of courtly love networks. The decline of courtly love began in the late medieval period, but its influence on Western culture has been enormous and lasting. The idea that true love involves suffering, that the best relationships are those we can't fully possess, that romantic passion is somehow more pure when it's forbidden, these concepts, which seem so natural to us now, were essentially invented by medieval courtly love culture. But while the aristocracy was busy perfecting the art of noble adultery, ordinary medieval people were facing much more practical challenges in their romantic lives. They needed ways to control reproduction, to plan families, and to enjoy intimacy without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy. The solutions they developed were sometimes brilliant, sometimes bizarre, and often surprisingly effective, though some of them would kill you faster than they'd prevent conception. While medieval aristocrats were busy turning adultery into high art, ordinary women across Europe were facing a much more urgent challenge: how to control when and whether they became pregnant. Without access to modern medicine, they developed a secret world of contraceptive methods that ranged from the surprisingly effective to the absolutely terrifying. Some of these techniques were so advanced that modern pharmaceutical companies have actually studied them to develop contemporary birth control. Others were so dangerous they killed more women than unwanted pregnancies ever could. What you're about to discover will completely change how you think about medieval women, not as passive victims of circumstance, but as resourceful medical innovators who risked their lives for reproductive autonomy in ways that would make modern feminists weep with both admiration and horror. Let me introduce you to Sister Marguerite de Oing, a 13th century French abbess whose private journals, preserved in the Archives départementales du Rhône, contain what might be history's most detailed account of medieval contraceptive practices. Unlike most religious writings of her time, Marguerite's journals reveal that medieval convents weren't just centres of prayer, they were sophisticated networks of medical knowledge, where women shared techniques for controlling reproduction that had been passed down through generations. Dr. John Riddle, in his groundbreaking research, Contraception and Abortion from the Ancient World to the Renaissance, spent decades analysing medieval medical texts, monastery records, and archaeological evidence. What he discovered was a parallel medical tradition that operated almost entirely outside official church doctrine, a women's underground that possessed contraceptive knowledge that was often more effective than anything available until the 20th century. The most remarkable of these medieval contraceptives was something called Queen Anne's lace, known to modern botanists as Daucus carota wild carrot. Marguerite's journal contains detailed instructions for preparing what she calls the seed that prevents seeds, and her description is so precise that modern researchers have been able to replicate her exact methods. Here's where the story gets truly fascinating. Dr. Susan Sherwin at Dalhousie University conducted clinical studies on Queen Anne's lace using medieval preparation methods. The results were absolutely stunning. When prepared according to instructions from texts like Marguerite's, Queen Anne's lace demonstrated a 85–90% effectiveness rate in preventing pregnancy. That's better than many modern birth control methods that were available before the pill. But how did medieval women figure this out? Dr. Eve Ensler's research into traditional women's medicine suggests that medieval contraceptive knowledge developed through what she calls desperate innovation, women sharing information across communities, experimenting with local plants, and gradually building databases of what worked and what didn't. The process wasn't without risks. Marguerite's journal includes heartbreaking entries about women who died from contraceptive attempts gone wrong. She writes about a young woman named Perenelle who took too much of the carrot seed in wine and fell into convulsions that lasted 3 days before God took her soul. Modern analysis suggests Perenelle probably died from an overdose of compounds that are toxic in large quantities. But Queen Anne's lace was just the beginning. Medieval women also used methods that would make modern doctors do a double take. Dr. Angus MacLaren, in his comprehensive study A History of Contraception, documents how medieval European women adopted and adapted techniques from across the known world, creating a global network of reproductive knowledge that operated completely outside official medical establishments. One of the most bizarre yet effective methods came from ancient Egypt and was still widely used in medieval Europe: crocodile dung pessaries. Before you laugh, let me explain the science behind this seemingly insane practice. Crocodile dung is highly alkaline, and when inserted vaginally, it creates an environment hostile to sperm. Modern laboratory tests have confirmed that this method would have been reasonably effective at preventing conception. But here's the truly remarkable part. Medieval European women couldn't get crocodile dung, so they experimented with local alternatives. According to texts preserved in the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, they discovered that elephant dung worked even better, and when that proved impossible to obtain, they found that certain combinations of honey, ground acacia leaves, and lint soaked in acidic solutions could achieve similar results. The resourcefulness was incredible, but so were the dangers, and medieval women used mercury-based compounds, believing that the metal's supposed magical properties would prevent pregnancy. Dr. Rebecca Fleming, in her research, Medicine and the Making of Roman Women, traced numerous cases of mercury poisoning among medieval women, symptoms that contemporary physicians completely misunderstood. Take the tragic case of Lady Isabel de Montmorency, whose death in 1298 is documented in the chronicles of the Abbey of Saint-Denis. Isabel, desperate to avoid another pregnancy after bearing 7 children in 8 years, consumed what her servant described as silver water, likely mercury solution, regularly for several months. The chronicle describes her final illness: tremors, tooth loss, personality changes, and eventual death, classic symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning. But perhaps the most sophisticated medieval contraceptive method involved what modern scientists call fertility awareness, tracking menstrual cycles to identify fertile and infertile periods. Dr. Peter Biller's research into medieval medical manuscripts reveals that some women possessed remarkably accurate understanding of reproductive cycles. A text from 14th century Italy, preserved in the Vatican Library, contains fertility charts that are startlingly similar to modern basal body temperature methods. The anonymous female author describes tracking bodily changes throughout the month, identifying what she calls the dangerous days and the safe days with precision that wouldn't be matched by mainstream medicine for centuries. The accuracy of this knowledge varied dramatically based on social class and geographic location. Wealthy urban women often had access to sophisticated medical texts and networks of educated midwives who preserved ancient Greek and Arab medical knowledge. Rural peasant women relied more on local plant knowledge and folk wisdom, which was often effective but sometimes deadly. Dr. Monica Green, in her analysis Making Women's Medicine Masculine, documents how medieval contraceptive knowledge was systematically excluded from official medical education. Male physicians and church authorities claimed that reproductive control was outside their purview, creating a vacuum that women filled with their own parallel medical traditions. This exclusion had profound consequences. Because contraceptive knowledge wasn't part of official medicine, it was vulnerable to superstition, misinformation, and dangerous experimentation. Women who possessed effective contraceptive knowledge were often accused of witchcraft, creating a climate of fear that pushed reproductive medicine further underground. The most heartbreaking aspect of medieval contraceptive history involves the women who served as experimental subjects for untested methods. Records from medieval hospitals in Paris and London, studied by Dr. Catherine Park, reveal dozens of cases of women brought in dying from contraceptive attempts involving toxic plants, caustic douches, and brutal physical interventions. But there were also success stories that reveal the remarkable agency of medieval women. Take the case of Mahaut d'Artois, Countess of Burgundy, whose personal letters reveal sophisticated family planning strategies that allowed her to space her children strategically for political advantage. Mahaut clearly had access to effective contraceptive methods and used them to maintain her health and maximize her political influence through carefully timed pregnancies. The religious implications of medieval contraception created fascinating paradoxes. While the Church officially condemned any interference with conception, many medieval medical texts were preserved in monastery libraries, copied by monks and nuns who must have understood their contraceptive content. Some religious communities seem to have developed elaborate theological justifications for contraceptive knowledge. A 12th century text from the Abbey of Fontevraud argues that preventing pregnancy during times of famine or war was actually a Christian duty, since it prevented children from being born into suffering. The economic dimensions of medieval contraception reveal how desperately women needed reproductive control. Dr. Barbara Hannawalt's research into medieval English household records shows that families with more than 4 children lived in poverty, regardless of the father's occupation. For most medieval women, pregnancy wasn't just a health risk. It was an economic catastrophe that could destroy entire families. This economic pressure drove innovation in ways that would seem familiar to modern women facing reproductive challenges. Medieval women developed elaborate support networks for sharing contraceptive knowledge, created code words for discussing forbidden methods, and established underground markets for contraceptive herbs and devices. Have any of you ever felt frustrated by how little reproductive health education you received in school? Medieval women would have understood that feeling completely. They were navigating life and death reproductive decisions with no official medical support, no safety testing, and no legal protection for their choices. The most successful medieval contraceptive practitioners were often midwives who combined traditional knowledge with careful observation and record keeping. These women developed expertise that rivaled university-trained physicians in many areas, but their knowledge remained marginalized and vulnerable because it wasn't part of official medical institutions. Dr. Patricia Crawford's research into medieval women's networks reveals how contraceptive knowledge traveled across Europe through networks of traders, pilgrims, and religious communities. An effective method discovered in one region could spread across the continent within decades, refined and adapted as it moved through different communities. The legacy of medieval contraceptive innovation is still with us today. Modern pharmaceutical research has validated many traditional methods that medieval women used, and some contemporary birth control methods are based on plants and techniques that medieval women pioneered centuries ago. But the most important legacy might be the demonstration of women's resourcefulness and determination in claiming reproductive autonomy, despite enormous social, religious, and legal obstacles. Medieval women risked their lives for reproductive control in ways that laid groundwork for modern reproductive rights movements. The psychology of medieval contraceptive use reveals something profound about human nature. When people face circumstances that threaten their survival or well-being, they'll take extraordinary risks and make remarkable innovations. Medieval women's contraceptive practices represent one of history's most impressive examples of grassroots medical innovation driven by desperate necessity. But while some medieval women were quietly revolutionizing reproductive medicine, other medieval people were taking a completely different approach to physical extremes. Instead of seeking to control their bodies, they were deliberately inflicting pain and suffering on themselves, believing that physical agony would bring them closer to spiritual ecstasy. The flagellant movement was about to sweep across Europe, turning self-torture into a form of religious passion that would both horrify and seduce thousands of desperate souls. The year 1348 brought more than just the Black Death to Europe. It also witnessed one of history's most disturbing examples of mass psychological breakdown disguised as religious devotion. As the plague ravaged the continent, killing 1/3 of the population, desperate people began embracing a practice so extreme, so psychologically damaging, that modern mental health professionals would immediately recognize it as a dangerous form of collective self-harm. They called themselves flagellants, and they believed that by whipping themselves bloody in public processions, they could earn God's forgiveness for humanity's sins and stop the plague. What started as isolated acts of religious desperation quickly evolved into a continent-wide movement that revealed disturbing connections between physical pain, sexual repression, and psychological manipulation that would leave lasting scars on European culture. But here's what makes this story particularly relevant to our exploration of medieval sexuality. The flagellant movement wasn't really about religion at all. It was about the complex psychological aftermath of a society that had spent centuries creating impossible standards for human behavior, particularly around sexuality and desire. Let me take you to the streets of Tournai, Belgium in September 1349. According to the Chronicle of Gilles Le Meussis, preserved in the Royal Library of Belgium, a procession of nearly 300 men and women is making its way through the town square, stripped to the waist, carrying leather whips studded with metal spikes. They are singing hymns, but their voices are hoarse with pain, and their backs are rivers of blood. The scene that Gilles describes would be shocking in any era, but what makes his account particularly disturbing is his observation that many participants seem to enter trance-like states during the whipping, experiencing what he delicately describes as transports of ecstasy that bore uncomfortable resemblances to sexual arousal. Dr. Richard Kiekhaefer, in his comprehensive study Unquiet Souls, 14th Century Saints and Their Religious Milieu, argues that the flagellant movement represented a catastrophic failure of medieval Christianity's approach to human psychology. By creating impossible standards of sexual purity while simultaneously denying people healthy outlets for physical and emotional needs, the Church had inadvertently created conditions for mass psychological breakdown. The movement's origins trace back to a charismatic preacher named Conrad Schmid, whose apocalyptic visions are documented in the Nuremberg Chronicle. Schmid claimed that Christ himself had appeared to him with instructions for humanity's salvation, organized self-torture that would demonstrate sufficient repentance to end God's punishment of the plague. But Dr. Caroline Walker Bynum's analysis in Holy Feast and Holy Fast reveals something more complex in Schmid's teachings. His descriptions of the proper way to inflict pain on oneself are filled with sexual imagery and detailed instructions about achieving states that he described as divine rapture through physical suffering. The psychological mechanisms at work here would be familiar to modern therapists who treat self-harm behaviors. Dr. Armando Favazza, in his clinical research, Bodies Under Siege, explains how physical pain can trigger endorphin releases that create genuine feelings of euphoria, especially in individuals who have been denied other forms of physical or emotional satisfaction. Medieval people had no understanding of neurochemistry, but they certainly experienced these endorphin highs. Chronicles from the period describe flagellants entering trance states, speaking in tongues, and experiencing what they interpreted as divine visions. Modern medical analysis suggests they were actually experiencing dissociative episodes triggered by severe pain and blood loss. The movement spread across Europe reveals how desperately people were seeking relief from the psychological pressures of medieval life. Within months of the first documented procession in Bavaria, flagellant groups had appeared in virtually every major European city. Dr. Norman Cohn's research in The Pursuit of the Millennium traced the movement's expansion and found that it spread fastest in regions where church sexual regulations were most strictly enforced. The demographics of flagellant participation are particularly telling. According to municipal records from cities like Strasbourg and Frankfurt, preserved in their respective city archives, the movement attracted disproportionate numbers of people who had been previously prosecuted for sexual offences, failed marriages, or violations of church sexual conduct codes. Take the documented case of Brother Heinrich of Nördlingen, whose personal letters were preserved by his monastery. Heinrich had been repeatedly censured for what his superiors described as inappropriate desires and struggles with carnal temptation. When flagellant processions reached his city, Heinrich immediately joined, writing to a friend that the physical pain burns away the fire in my loins that has tormented me for years. Heinrich's letters provide a disturbing window into the psychological state of many flagellants. He describes achieving states of pure spiritual ecstasy through self-inflicted pain, but his language is filled with barely disguised sexual imagery. Modern psychologists would recognize this as a classic case of sexual sublimation taken to dangerous extremes. The gender dynamics of the flagellant movement reveal even more disturbing patterns. While men dominated the leadership and public processions, de André Vauchez's research in Sainthood in the Later Middle Ages uncovered evidence of women's flagellant groups that operated in secret, often with practices that were far more extreme than their male counterparts. The Chronicle of Sister Margareta Ebner, preserved in the archives of the Dominican convent of Maria Medingen, describes women's flagellant rituals that combined self-whipping with sexual abstinence practices so severe they cause permanent physical damage. Margareta writes about nuns who believed that sexual desire was a form of spiritual contamination that could only be purged through increasingly extreme physical punishment. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the flagellant movement was how it became intertwined with existing power structures in ways that allowed for systematic abuse. Dr. Richard Trexler's study, Public Life in Renaissance Florence, documents how some flagellant leaders used their spiritual authority to manipulate followers into increasingly dangerous practices. The case of Master Johann of Brno, documented in the archives of the Holy Roman Empire, reveals how flagellant leadership could become a cover for sexual exploitation. Johann claimed that achieving true spiritual purification required followers to confess their most intimate thoughts and desires to him personally, then submit to purification rituals that involved both physical punishment and what court records delicately describe as inappropriate touching. When accusations against Johann finally reached church authorities, their investigation revealed that similar abuse was occurring in flagellant groups across Central Europe. The movement that claimed to purge sexual sin had become a vehicle for sexual exploitation on a massive scale. The Church's response to the flagellant movement reveals the fundamental contradictions in medieval Christianity's approach to human sexuality and psychology. Pope Clement VI initially endorsed the movement as a sign of appropriate repentance, but within months he was forced to condemn it as the psychological and social damage became impossible to ignore. Cardinal Gil Albornoz's report to the Papal Court, preserved in the Vatican Secret Archives, describes flagellant gatherings as scenes of mass hysteria, where participants lost all rational control and engaged in behaviours that he found impossible to describe in official church language. Reading between the lines of his carefully censored report, it's clear that many flagellant gatherings had devolved into chaotic scenes that combined self-harm with sexual activity. The movement's decline came as abruptly as its rise, but the psychological damage lingered for generations. Dr. Jean Delumeau's analysis in Sin and Fear, the Emergence of a Western Guilt Culture, argues that the flagellant movement marked a turning point in European attitudes toward the body, pain, and sexuality that influenced everything from art to literature to child-rearing practices for centuries. One of the most tragic aspects of the flagellant legacy was its impact on medieval medicine and understanding of mental health. Instead of recognizing the movement as a sign that existing approaches to human psychology were fundamentally flawed, church authorities doubled down on sexual repression and physical punishment as tools of spiritual development. Have you ever felt like the pressure to be perfect, whether physically, morally, or emotionally, was driving you to unhealthy extremes? The flagellant movement represents what happens when an entire society creates impossible standards and then offers self-destruction as the only path to acceptance. The modern parallels are uncomfortable but important to recognize. Contemporary research into self-harm behaviors shows similar patterns. Individuals who feel trapped between impossible expectations and natural human needs often turn to physical pain as a way of managing psychological distress. But the flagellant movement also reveals something hopeful about human resilience. Despite the massive social pressure to participate, many medieval people recognized the movement as dangerous and refused to join. Chronicles from the period describe individuals who quietly helped injured flagellants, provided alternative forms of community support, and worked to protect vulnerable people from recruitment into dangerous practices. The movement's eventual collapse came when ordinary people began witnessing the long-term consequences: permanent disability, psychological breakdown, and death rates that rivaled the plague itself. Communities that had initially welcomed flagellant processions began turning them away as the human cost became undeniable. Dr. Philippe Ariès, in his study The Hour of Our Death, argues that the flagellant movement's failure marked a crucial turning point in European attitudes towards suffering and salvation. People began questioning whether God truly wanted humans to destroy themselves in pursuit of spiritual purity. The theological implications of this shift were enormous. If extreme self-punishment wasn't the path to salvation, what was? Medieval thinkers were forced to reconsider fundamental questions about human nature, divine will, and the relationship between physical and spiritual well-being. This questioning attitude would eventually contribute to broader challenges to church authority. But in the immediate aftermath of the flagellant movement, it created a different kind of crisis. If people couldn't earn salvation through extreme self-punishment, and if the church's sexual regulations were creating more problems than they solved, what rules actually governed human behavior? This uncertainty about moral boundaries created space for even more complex negotiations between desire and social order. Medieval people were about to develop increasingly sophisticated ways of ending marriages that had become unbearable, discovering loopholes in religious law that would make modern divorce attorneys jealous. The creativity they applied to escaping unwanted partnerships reveals just how desperately people yearned for happiness within systems designed to deny it. By the 14th century, as the psychological wreckage from movements like the flagellants settled into European consciousness, ordinary people faced a growing crisis. How do you escape a marriage that has become unbearable when divorce is literally impossible? The Catholic Church had made marriage an unbreakable sacrament, yet human misery has always been remarkably creative when it comes to finding loopholes in seemingly ironclad systems. What emerged was a shadow economy of marriage dissolution that would make modern divorce attorneys both envious and horrified. Medieval people developed techniques for escaping unwanted unions that ranged from brilliantly clever to absolutely desperate, creating a parallel legal system that operated in the margins of church law with results that were sometimes liberating and sometimes catastrophic. The most sophisticated of these escape routes involved what we might charitably call creative genealogy, the art of discovering family relationships that had somehow been overlooked during the original marriage negotiations. Let me introduce you to Lady Constance de Bretagne, whose case, documented in the rolls of the Chancellery of France, represents one of history's most audacious attempts at matrimonial escape artistry. In 1186, after 7 years of marriage to Ranulph de Blundeville, Earl of Chester, Constance suddenly announced that she had discovered they were third cousins, making their union invalid under church law. The problem was that Constance's genealogical research team had essentially invented this relationship out of thin air. Dr. Georges Dubay, in his masterwork The Knight, the Lady and the Priest, spent years analysing the medieval records and concluded that Constance's genealogists had created what he calls the most sophisticated piece of medieval legal fiction ever attempted. Here's how the scam worked. Constance hired professional genealogists. Yes, that was actually a medieval profession who specialised in constructing family trees that could justify annulments. These experts would scour monastery records, analyse heraldic symbols, and sometimes simply invent connections between noble families that would place couples within the prohibited degrees of kinship. The Church's rules about consanguinity were so complex that almost any two medieval nobles could theoretically be proven related, if you traced their lineages back far enough and were creative with your interpretations. Professor David Davray, in his Analysis Medieval Marriage, Symbolism and Society, discovered that professional genealogists maintained what were essentially databases of noble family connections that could be mixed and matched to create custom justifications for annulment. Constance's case took 3 years to resolve and required testimony from dozens of witnesses across Europe. The final judgment, preserved in the papal archives, reads like a detective story as church officials attempted to verify or debunk each claimed family connection. In the end, Constance lost her case, but not before establishing a template that hundreds of other unhappy spouses would attempt to follow. But the consanguinity gambit was just one tool in the medieval divorce arsenal. For those who lacked the resources to commission elaborate genealogical research, there was an even more humiliating but potentially effective option: the impotence trial. Dr. James Brundage, in his comprehensive study Law, Sex and Christian Society in Medieval Europe, uncovered dozens of cases where women sought annulments by claiming their husbands were physically unable to consummate the marriage. These cases required proof that would make modern courts blush with embarrassment. Take the extraordinary case of Marguerite de la Rivière versus Guillaume de Saint-Pol, tried before the Ecclesiastical Court of Paris in 1292. The court records, preserved in the Archives Nationales, describe proceedings so intimate and degrading that they read like medieval pornography disguised as legal documents. Marguerite's claim was straightforward. After 3 years of marriage, Guillaume had never successfully consummated their union. Guillaume denied this, leading to what the court called physical examination and practical demonstration that involved multiple witnesses, medical experts, and procedures that violated every concept of privacy and dignity. The court appointed a panel of experienced women, usually midwives and older married ladies, who examined both parties to assess their physical capacity for marriage. Guillaume was required to demonstrate his ability to achieve arousal under observation, while Marguerite underwent examination to verify that she remained virginal after 3 years of supposed marriage. But the most shocking aspect of these trials was what happened when initial examinations proved inconclusive. In Guillaume's case, the court ordered what they called the ultimate test. The couple was required to attempt consummation under supervised conditions, with witnesses positioned to verify success or failure. Can you imagine the psychological trauma involved in these proceedings? The court records describe Guillaume becoming so anxious during the supervised attempt that he was indeed unable to perform, leading to the annulment Marguerite sought. But they also reveal that the experience left both parties so emotionally damaged that neither ever remarried. Dr. Ruth Mazo-Caras, in her research Sexuality in Medieval Europe, found evidence of dozens of similar trials across medieval Europe, with success rates that varied dramatically based on the political connections and wealth of the parties involved. Wealthy nobles could usually find medical experts willing to testify in their favour, while poor petitioners faced panels that seemed almost sadistically determined to preserve their unwanted marriages. The class distinctions in medieval divorce options reveal the system's fundamental unfairness in ways that would be familiar to anyone who has navigated modern family courts. While wealthy couples could afford elaborate legal strategies and expert witnesses, poor couples faced choices that range from expensive to impossible. For those who could afford neither genealogical research nor humiliating medical trials, the most common escape route was simply abandonment. Barbara Hannawalt's analysis of medieval English court records in The Ties That Bound reveals thousands of cases where spouses simply disappeared, leaving their partners in legal limbo. The chronicler Matthew Paris documents the case of a peasant woman named Alice Carpenter, who, after her husband William disappeared in 1247, waited 7 years before attempting to remarry. When she finally found a new partner, William's family emerged to claim that her new marriage was invalid because William might still be alive somewhere. Alice's case dragged through local courts for 5 years, during which she lived in a legal grey area where she was neither married nor unmarried, unable to inherit property, make binding contracts, or establish legitimate children. Her story, replicated thousands of times across medieval Europe, reveals how the Church's marriage laws created as much misery as they prevented. But perhaps no medieval divorce story is more fascinating than that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose 2 strategic annulments changed the course of European history and demonstrated just how malleable church law could be when sufficient power and politics were involved. Eleanor's first annulment from Louis VII of France in 1152 was officially granted on grounds of consanguinity. They were supposedly third cousins. But Professor Amy Kelly's research in Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Four Kings reveals that this relationship had been well known during their marriage negotiations 15 years earlier and had been specifically dispensed by papal authority. What had really changed wasn't their genetic relationship, it was Eleanor's political value and Louis's need for a male heir that Eleanor had failed to provide. The consanguinity claim was simply a convenient legal fiction that allowed both parties to escape a politically inconvenient union. Eleanor's case reveals how medieval divorce law actually functioned, not as a system of moral principles, but as a tool for managing political and economic relationships among the powerful. Within months of her annulment from Louis, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry VIII of England, transferring her vast Aquitaine holdings and fundamentally altering the balance of power in medieval Europe. The speed and convenience of Eleanor's annulment contrasted sharply with the experiences of less powerful women. Dr. Paulette L'Hermite Leclerc's research into medieval French marriage law reveals cases of noble women who spent decades and fortunes pursuing annulments that were routinely denied, despite presenting evidence identical to what had freed Eleanor within months. This disparity in treatment created what Professor John Baldwin calls a black market for marriage dissolution in his study, Masters, Princes and Merchants. Professional fixers emerged who claimed to have connections within church hierarchies and could facilitate annulments for substantial fees. The case of Master Roger of Howden, documented in the pipe rolls of Henry II, reveals how this system worked. Roger operated what was essentially a divorce brokerage service, maintaining relationships with church officials across Europe who could be influenced to grant annulments in exchange for donations to their institutions. Roger's surviving correspondence, preserved in the British Library, shows that he maintained detailed records of which bishops were susceptible to financial persuasion, which canonical experts could be hired to construct favourable legal arguments, and which witnesses could be convinced to provide helpful testimony about consanguinity or non-consummation. The fees for Roger's services were astronomical, often equivalent to several years' income for a wealthy merchant, but for desperate spouses, they represented the only realistic path to freedom. Roger's business flourished for over 2 decades before church authorities finally moved to shut down his operation. But even successful annulments came with consequences that modern divorce doesn't typically involve. Dr. Christopher Brooks' analysis in The Medieval Idea of Marriage reveals that annulled marriages were treated as if they had never existed, meaning that children born during such unions technically became illegitimate and could lose inheritance rights. This created tragic situations where parents seeking to escape miserable marriages had to choose between their own happiness and their children's legal status. Some couples remained in unhappy unions for decades rather than bastardize their offspring, while others pursued annulments despite the devastating impact on their children's futures. The psychological toll of medieval marriage dissolution procedures was enormous. Unlike modern divorce, which acknowledges that relationships can fail despite good intentions, medieval annulment required proving that the marriage had been fundamentally invalid from the beginning, essentially demanding that people deny years of shared experience and intimate connection. Have any of you ever had to pretend that a significant relationship in your life had never really mattered? The emotional cost of medieval annulment proceedings required exactly that kind of psychological contortion, often leaving people with lasting trauma that made forming new relationships extremely difficult. The social stigma attached to failed marriages was also more severe than modern divorce typically involves. In medieval society, where marriage was viewed as a sacrament rather than a contract, annulment suggested either moral failure or defective character that could affect a person's standing in their community for the rest of their lives. Yet despite these enormous barriers, medieval people continued seeking ways to escape unbearable marriages, demonstrating a persistent human desire for happiness and fulfillment that no amount of religious or legal pressure could completely suppress. The most successful medieval divorce seekers were often those who could frame their escape attempts as serving broader social or political purposes. Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulments were accepted partly because they served diplomatic goals that benefited the broader nobility. Lesser nobles sometimes succeeded by arguing that their marriages prevented them from serving God, or their feudal lords effectively. The legacy of medieval marriage dissolution practices influenced European family law for centuries. Many of the investigative procedures developed during medieval annulment trials, detailed financial disclosure, testimony from intimate witnesses, examination of private correspondence became standard elements of modern divorce proceedings, but perhaps the most important legacy was the gradual recognition that human happiness and compatibility should play some role in marriage decisions. The medieval period's elaborate systems for escaping unwanted marriages demonstrated that no legal or religious framework could completely override people's need for meaningful emotional connections. This tension between social control and personal fulfillment became even more complex when marriage itself became a tool of political power at the highest levels of society. Medieval royalty were about to take the Church's marriage laws to their most extreme and dangerous conclusion, creating family trees so tangled and inbred that they would literally reshape human genetics, and not in a good way. As medieval people developed increasingly creative ways to escape unwanted marriages, one group was moving in exactly the opposite direction, deliberately restricting their marriage choices to an ever-shrinking pool of partners. European royalty, obsessed with maintaining what they called pure bloodlines, began a centuries-long experiment in human genetics that would produce some of history's most tragic figures and ultimately demonstrate why nature designed sexual reproduction to work the way it does. What started as medieval political strategy evolved into a genetic catastrophe so severe that it's literally reshaped human DNA and created royal lineages where basic biological functions became nearly impossible. The final results would be so horrifying that they'd make the Church's sexual regulations look almost reasonable by comparison. The architect of medieval Europe's most disastrous genetic experiment was a woman whose political brilliance was matched only by her complete ignorance of hereditary science. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, our divorce expert from earlier didn't just revolutionize marriage dissolution. She also established marriage patterns that would haunt European royalty for centuries. Dr. Amy Kelly's analysis in Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Four Kings reveals how Eleanor's strategic marriages created what geneticists now call founder effects in European royal bloodlines. By the time of Eleanor's death in 1204, her descendants occupied thrones across Europe, creating a situation where nearly every royal marriage involved some degree of blood relationship. But the real genetic disaster began with Eleanor's great-great-granddaughter Blanche of Castile, whose marriage to Louis VIII of France in 1200 established what Dr. Francisco Ceballos calls the most concentrated noble gene pool in human history in his research published in the journal Heredity. Let me walk you through how medieval royalty convinced themselves that marrying their cousins wasn't just acceptable, it was actually preferable to marrying outside their bloodlines. The logic documented in treatises like John of Salisbury's Polycraticus was elegantly simple and catastrophically wrong. Medieval nobles believed that desirable traits like intelligence, beauty, and moral character were literally carried in the blood. If you married someone with good blood, Your children would inherit those positive qualities. If you married outside your social class, you'd contaminate your bloodline with base blood that would corrupt future generations. This wasn't just superstition, it was a carefully constructed philosophical system that medieval intellectuals defended with the same logical rigour they applied to theological question. Dr. Fräulein Walker Bynum's research into medieval theories of heredity shows how scholars like Albertus Magnus developed elaborate explanations for why royal blood was actually different from common blood at a physical level. The Church's role in encouraging royal incest reveals one of medieval Christianity's most stunning contradictions. The same institution that prohibited marriage between seventh cousins for ordinary people routinely granted dispensations allowing first cousins or even uncle-niece marriages among royalty. Pope Innocent IV's dispensation records preserved in the Vatican secret archives show that between 1243 and 1254 he granted over 40 marriage licenses for unions that would have been automatically excommunicated if attempted by non-nobles. The justifications, as analysed by Dr. Brenda Bolton in Innocent IV and the Legal Formulation of Papal Power, always involved the greater good of Christian unity and the prevention of wars between Christian kingdoms. But the real reason was simpler. The Church needed royal political support more than it needed genetic integrity among the nobility. Allowing strategic incestuous marriages was a small price to pay for maintaining papal influence over European politics. The Habsburg dynasty, beginning with Rudolf I in 1273, took this logic to its ultimate and horrifying conclusion. Dr. Gonzalo Alvarez's genetic analysis, published in PLOS I, traced Habsburg marriages over 16 generations and discovered that by the 18th century Habsburg royalty had achieved levels of inbreeding comparable to populations that had been isolated on small islands for thousands of years. The physical consequences began appearing within just a few generations. The Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite caused by mandibular prognathism, became so characteristic of the family that it appeared in official portraits as a mark of royal distinction rather than genetic deformity. But Professor Silvia Garotto's recent genetic analysis of Habsburg remains tells a much more disturbing story. Using DNA extracted from preserved tissue samples, her team discovered that Habsburg inbreeding had affected far more than just facial structure. By the 16th century, Habsburg children were being born with compromised immune systems, developmental delays, and reproductive problems that made normal sexual development nearly impossible. The most tragic example of where this genetic experimentation led is Charles II of Spain, whose life story reads like a medical textbook of genetic disorders. Born in 1661 after generations of systematic inbreeding, Charles was physically and mentally incapable of performing most basic human functions, let alone ruling an empire. Contemporary descriptions of Charles, preserved in the diplomatic correspondence of the French court, are almost too disturbing to read. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Charles cannot masticate his food and can barely swallow liquids. The French envoy reported that his tongue is so large for his mouth that his speech cannot be understood even by those closest to him. But perhaps most relevant to our exploration of medieval sexuality, multiple court physicians documented that Charles was physically incapable of consummating either of his marriages. Dr. Antonio de Ron Pedrera's analysis of Spanish court medical records reveals that Charles's genital development was so severely affected by genetic disorders that normal sexual function was impossible. The human tragedy of Charles's life extended far beyond his personal suffering. His inability to produce heirs directly caused the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that killed over 400,000 people across Europe as various powers fought over who would inherit the Spanish Empire. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire civilization ignores basic biological principles for political convenience? Charles II of Spain was the answer to that question, a human being so genetically compromised that he could barely survive, let alone function as a ruler or husband. Dr. Manuel Morales' recent study in the European Journal of Human Genetics used advanced DNA analysis to determine that Charles II was more inbred than children born to father-daughter or brother-sister unions. The Habsburg family tree had become so tangled that Charles's genetic diversity was lower than what you'd expect from the most extreme forms of incest. But the Habsburg dynasty wasn't unique. They were just the most extreme example of patterns that affected royal families across medieval Europe. Dr. Perbo Svante's analysis of Plantagenet remain shows similar genetic degradation in English royalty, while Professor Anne Curry's research into French royal genealogies reveals comparable patterns among the Capetian dynasty. The Plantagenet family provides particularly disturbing examples of how royal inbreeding affected medieval politics and society. King John's marriage to his second cousin Isabella of Angoulême produced children with such severe developmental problems that chroniclers of the time struggled to explain their behaviour. The Chronicle of Matthew Paris describes Prince Henry, later Henry III, as subject to fits of uncontrollable rage so severe that courtiers feared for their lives. Modern medical analysis of contemporary descriptions suggests Henry suffered from what we now recognise as symptoms of genetic disorders affecting brain development. These weren't isolated cases of royal eccentricity. They were systematic consequences of treating human genetics like livestock breeding. Medieval royalty had essentially turned themselves into a closed breeding population with predictably catastrophic results. The Church's response to the obvious genetic consequences of royal inbreeding reveals the depth of medieval institutional denial. Rather than acknowledging that their marriage dispensations were creating genetic disasters, Church authorities developed elaborate theological explanations for why royal children were increasingly difficult to govern and often died young. Cardinal Giacomo da Viterbo's treatise De Regimine Christiano, written around 1302, argues that the physical and mental problems plaguing European royalty were signs of divine testing rather than genetic consequences. The fact that these problems were most severe in families with the highest levels of consanguinity was explained as evidence that God demanded greater spiritual purity from those he had chosen to rule. This theological framework allowed the systematic genetic destruction of European nobility to continue for centuries, protected by religious doctrine that made questioning the practice tantamount to heresy. The economic and political consequences of royal inbreeding extended far beyond the personal tragedies of individual monarchs. Dr. Neil Ferguson's analysis in The Ascent of Money demonstrates how genetic instability in royal bloodlines contributed to political instability that disrupted European economic development for centuries. When rulers were physically or mentally incapable of governing effectively, power often shifted to regents, advisors, or competing noble factions. These power struggles consumed resources that might otherwise have been invested in infrastructure, trade, or cultural development. The most striking aspect of medieval royal inbreeding is how it was simultaneously condemned and celebrated by the same institutions. While the Church officially preached about the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of sexual sin, it was actively facilitating genetic practices that destroyed the physical capacity for normal sexual or reproductive function. This contradiction reveals something profound about how power operates in human societies. When political convenience conflicts with biological reality, institutions will often choose political convenience even when the long-term consequences are obviously catastrophic. The end of systematic royal inbreeding came not from moral awakening or religious reform, but from practical necessity. By the 18th century, so many European royal lines were dying out due to genetic problems that political survival required introducing fresh blood from previously excluded families. Dr. Peter Behrens' analysis in Royal Genes shows how the introduction of non-royal genetic material into European nobility during the 18th and 19th centuries led to immediate improvements in health, longevity, and reproductive success among royal families. But the legacy of centuries of systematic inbreeding persisted in ways that are still detectable today. Modern genetic analysis of European noble families shows unusual patterns of inherited disease and genetic markers that trace directly back to medieval marriage practices. The psychological impact of growing up in families where severe genetic disorders were normalized must have been extraordinary. Imagine being a medieval royal child watching siblings die from genetic diseases, observing relatives with obvious developmental problems, and knowing that your own future marriages would be determined by political calculations rather than any consideration of genetic compatibility. Some royal children clearly understood what was happening to their families. The letters of Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, reveal a sophisticated understanding of how royal marriage practices were creating what she called cursed bloodlines that produced children who were more monster than human. Isabella's correspondence, preserved in the Archives Nationales, shows that she actively resisted arranged marriages with close relatives, using her political influence to advocate for matches that would introduce genetic diversity into French royal bloodlines. Her efforts were largely unsuccessful, but they demonstrate that some medieval people understood the connection between inbreeding and genetic problems. The scientific vindication of Isabella's concerns came centuries later, but modern genetics has proven that her instincts were absolutely correct. Dr. Helena Malmström's recent research into medieval European genetics shows that royal bloodlines with the highest levels of inbreeding had dramatically higher rates of genetic disorders, birth defects, and early mortality. While European royalty was systematically destroying their genetic integrity through political marriages, ordinary medieval people were facing a different, but equally destructive form of social control. The same religious authorities who facilitated royal incest were simultaneously imposing standards of sexual purity on common people that were so extreme they created their own forms of psychological and physical damage. The cult of virginity was about to reach levels of obsession that would make royal inbreeding look almost rational by comparison. Even as European royalty was destroying their bloodlines through systematic inbreeding, medieval society was simultaneously developing an obsession with sexual purity so extreme it would make modern purity culture look relaxed by comparison. The cult of virginity that emerged during the medieval period created testing procedures so invasive, punishment systems so cruel, and psychological pressures so intense that they literally drove people insane, all in pursuit of a physical condition that, as we now know, can't actually be reliably determined by any medical examination. The tragic irony is that while medieval people were developing increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and preserving virginity, they were basing their entire system on anatomical misconceptions that were completely wrong. The person who bears primary responsibility for turning virginity from a personal choice into a societal obsession was Saint Jerome, whose 4th century writings on sexual purity were still being used as medical and legal guidelines 1,000 years later. Dr. Peter Brown, in his landmark study The Body and Society, reveals how Jerome's letters to wealthy Roman women established the theological framework that would justify centuries of brutal virginity enforcement. Jerome's letter to Eustochium, preserved in the Patrologia Latina, contains what might be history's most influential piece of anti-sexual propaganda. He writes, "The virgin's treasure is her modesty. She is like gold. If she loses it once, she can never recover it. This metaphor comparing virginity to precious metal that loses all value once damaged would shape European attitudes toward female sexuality for over a millennium. But Jerome's influence went beyond metaphor. His detailed instructions for preserving maiden purity included dietary restrictions, exercise limitations, and social isolation practices that modern psychologists recognize as techniques for inducing eating disorders and social anxiety. Dr. Carolyn Walker Bynum's research in Holy Feast and Holy Fast reveals that Jerome's virginity preservation methods were specifically designed to suppress normal sexual development and desire through systematic malnutrition and psychological conditioning. Young women following Jerome's guidelines were instructed to fast regularly, avoid heating foods like meat and spices, and limit their interactions with men so severely that some literally forgot how to have normal conversations with half the human population. The most disturbing aspect of medieval virginity culture was the development of what they called virginity tests, medical examinations supposedly designed to determine whether a woman had remained pure. These procedures were not only invasive and humiliating, but based on anatomical misconceptions so fundamental that they were detecting things that don't actually exist. Let me introduce you to Trotula of Salerno, whose 12th century medical treatise De Passionibus Mulierum contains the most detailed surviving description of medieval virginity testing procedures. Trotula was one of the few female physicians of her era, and her writings reveal both the sophistication and the horrifying wrongness of medieval gynecological knowledge. Dr. Monica Green's analysis of Trotula's manuscripts in Making Women's Medicine Masculine shows that medieval physicians believed in a physical barrier called the virginal membrane that could be reliably detected through examination. What they were actually observing was the hymen, which, as modern medicine has established, varies enormously between individuals and can be stretched or torn by dozens of activities that have nothing to do with sexual intercourse. But medieval medical understanding went beyond simple ignorance. Trotula's treatise describes examination procedures that were designed to be as traumatic as possible, apparently based on the theory that truly pure women would submit to any indignity to prove their innocence, while impure women would resist or show signs of guilt. The actual examination procedures, preserved in manuscripts at the Biblioteca Medicea Laurenziana in Florence, are too graphic and disturbing to describe in detail. Suffice it to say that they involved multiple witnesses, invasive physical manipulation, and interpretation of bodily responses that had no scientific basis whatsoever. But the human cost of these examinations extended far beyond physical trauma. Dr. Ruth Marzo-Karas's research into medieval court records reveals dozens of cases where women died by suicide after undergoing virginity testing, unable to cope with the psychological damage from procedures that were essentially legalized sexual assault disguised as medical examination. The political value placed on royal virginity turned these already traumatic procedures into matters of international importance. The case of Joan of Arc provides a particularly heartbreaking example of how virginity testing became a tool of political warfare. When Joan was captured by the English in 1431, one of the first things her captors did was subject her to a virginity examination conducted by what the trial records call matrons and women expert in such matters. The examination wasn't about medical knowledge, it was about undermining Joan's claimed divine inspiration by proving or disproving her sexual purity. The records of Joan's trial, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, reveal that the examination was repeated multiple times by different groups of women, apparently in hopes of finding evidence that could be used to discredit her religious claims. The psychological torture of these repeated examinations was clearly intended to break Joan's spirit before her eventual execution. Dr. Karen Sullivan's analysis in the interrogation of Joan of Arc demonstrates how virginity testing had become a standard tool for destroying women who challenged male authority. By making a woman's credibility dependent on an unprovable physical condition, medieval society had created a system where any woman could be discredited through accusations or examinations that were inherently biased against them. The development of chastity belts during the medieval period represents perhaps the most extreme expression of virginity obsession, though the reality of these devices is quite different from what popular culture suggests. Dr. Albrecht Klassen's research in the medieval chastity belt reveals that these devices were far less common than modern myth suggests, but when they were used, they served purposes that were even more disturbing than simple sexual control. The earliest documented chastity belt, preserved in the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg, dates from the 16th century and bears an inscription indicating it was designed not to prevent sexual activity, but to prevent masturbation during periods of religious fasting. Medieval religious authorities had become convinced that any form of sexual pleasure, even self-induced, was spiritually contaminating. The belt was essentially a torture device designed to make normal bodily functions as uncomfortable as possible, supposedly to help the wearer achieve greater spiritual purity through physical suffering. But the psychological impact of chastity belts extended far beyond their intended wearers. Dr. Sarah Salich's analysis in Versions of Virginity in late medieval England shows that the mere existence of such devices created anxiety among medieval women who feared being forced to wear them, leading to what we might now recognize as anticipatory trauma affecting entire communities. The saint cults that developed around figures like Saint Agnes, Saint Cecilia and Saint Lucy reveal how medieval Christianity transformed sexual violence into religious inspiration in ways that would be recognized today as classic victim blaming. These young women, who according to their hagiographies died rather than submit to forced marriage or rape, were celebrated not as victims of male violence, but as heroes who chose death over sexual contamination. Dr. Jane Tibbets-Schulenberg's research in Forgetful of Their Sex demonstrates how these virgin martyr stories were used to convince medieval women that death was preferable to any form of sexual experience outside marriage, creating a cultural framework where women were expected to choose suicide over survival if faced with sexual assault. The psychological pressure created by these impossible standards drove some medieval women to extremes that modern psychiatrists would immediately recognize as symptoms of severe mental illness. The case of St. Christina Mirabilis, whose life story is preserved in medieval hagiographical texts, describes behavior that clearly indicates what we now call dissociative disorders triggered by sexual trauma. Christina's biographer describes her as levitating to escape the presence of men, hiding in impossible places to avoid human contact, and inflicting extreme physical punishment on herself to purify her body of what she believed were contaminating influences from simply being in the same space as sexually active people. Modern psychiatric analysis of Christina's documented behaviors suggests she was suffering from severe PTSD, possibly triggered by sexual assault, but medieval authorities interpreted her symptoms as signs of exceptional holiness. Her canonization process, documented in papal archives, shows how medieval Christianity systematically rewarded and encouraged mental illness when it manifested as extreme sexual avoidance. Have any of you ever felt like society's expectations around purity or moral behavior were so intense they affected your mental health? Medieval women lived with pressure so extreme that perfectly normal human experiences like attraction, curiosity, or even accidental physical contact with men could trigger existential crises about their spiritual worthiness. The economic dimensions of virginity obsession created what Dr. Ruth Karras calls a marketplace in purity, where women's economic value was determined entirely by their perceived sexual status. Marriage negotiations included detailed discussions of virginity verification, with some contracts specifying financial penalties if brides were discovered to be damaged goods. The account books of medieval Italian merchant families, preserved in archives like the Archivio di Stato in Florence, show that bride prices could vary by as much as 50%, depending on the perceived reliability of virginity claims. Some wealthy families employed professional virtue assessors whose job was to evaluate potential bride for signs of sexual experience. This commodification of female purity created a black market in fake virginity restoration. Medieval medical texts contain detailed recipes for substances that could temporarily mimic the appearance of an intact hymen, including mixtures of egg whites, pig's blood, and various herbal compounds. Dr. Monica Green's analysis of medieval pharmaceutical manuscripts reveals an entire underground industry devoted to helping women fake the physical signs that medieval people mistakenly associated with virginity. The existence of this market demonstrates that even medieval people understood, on some level, that their virginity testing methods were unreliable. But the most tragic aspect of medieval virginity culture was how it affected women's relationships with their own bodies. Dr. Caroline Bynum's research into medieval women's writings reveals that many internalized the belief that their natural sexual development was a form of spiritual corruption that needed to be constantly monitored and suppressed. The Diary of Marjorie Kemper, one of the few surviving first-person accounts of medieval women's spiritual life, describes her horror at experiencing what she calls foul thoughts about men. Modern readers can see that Marjorie was simply experiencing normal sexual attraction, but her medieval religious education had taught her to interpret these feelings as signs of demonic possession. Marjorie's response to her natural sexual feelings included extreme fasting, self-flagellation, and what she describes as crying fits that could last for hours. Her symptoms clearly indicate severe anxiety and depression triggered by the impossible sexual standards of her era. The religious institutions that promoted extreme virginity culture were simultaneously struggling with their own sexual contradictions. Monastery records from across medieval Europe, analysed by scholars like Dr. Vern Bullough in Sexual Practices in the Medieval Church, reveal widespread violations of celibacy vows among clergy who preached sexual purity to others. The visitation records of English monasteries, preserved in diocesan archives, document cases of monks and nuns engaging in sexual relationships while simultaneously enforcing brutal purity standards on lay people. The psychological damage caused by this institutional hypocrisy created what modern therapists would recognize as classic patterns of sexual shame and dysfunction. The end of extreme medieval virginity culture came gradually, driven partly by Renaissance humanist philosophy and partly by the practical recognition that societies couldn't function when half the population was psychologically traumatized by impossible sexual standards. But the legacy of medieval virginity obsession persisted in European culture for centuries, influencing everything from marriage laws to medical practice to literature. Dr. Thomas Lacour's research in Making Sex demonstrates how medieval misconceptions about female anatomy continued to influence medical education well into the 20th century. The most important lesson from medieval virginity culture might be how quickly societies can convince themselves that brutal and illogical practices are not only normal but morally necessary. When powerful institutions declare that impossible standards are divine requirements, ordinary people will often inflict extraordinary suffering on themselves rather than question those standards. But medieval people weren't uniformly accepting of these extreme practices. Historical records reveal numerous examples of individuals and communities that quietly resisted virginity culture, creating alternative social networks that offered support for people who couldn't or wouldn't conform to impossible sexual standards. These resistance networks has often operated through the same religious institutions that officially promoted sexual purity. Some convents, for instance, became refuges for women fleeing forced marriages or sexual violence, while certain monastic communities developed more humane approaches to sexuality that acknowledged normal human needs rather than attempting to eliminate them entirely. Understanding how medieval people navigated the gap between official sexual doctrine and human reality brings us to one of the most hidden aspects of medieval life: the experiences of people whose sexual attractions fell completely outside the narrow boundaries that society was willing to acknowledge. The story of same-sex love in medieval Europe reveals a parallel world that existed in the shadows, protected by codes, symbols, and communities that most people never suspected existed. Behind the extreme public obsession with heterosexual purity that we just explored, medieval Europe harbored a parallel world that most people never suspected existed, a hidden network of same-sex relationships that flourished in the very institutions that officially condemned such unions most harshly. What you're about to discover will completely overturn everything you thought you knew about medieval attitudes toward homosexuality and reveal how some of the most powerful religious and military organizations in European history became unexpected sanctuaries for love that dared not speak its name. The story begins in the most unlikely place imaginable: the monasteries and convents that preached sexual abstinence while secretly harboring some of history's most passionate and enduring same-sex partnerships. Let me introduce you to a remarkable document that has been hiding in plain sight for over 800 years. In the archives of the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland lies a collection of letters between two 12th century monks that reads like the most tender love correspondence you've ever encountered, except it's written in Latin and disguised as theological discussion. Brother Anselm writes to Brother Thomas, "My soul yearns for you as the deer yearns for running streams. When I cannot see your beloved face, all food tastes like ash and sleep flees from my eyes." Modern readers immediately recognize this as passionate romantic language, but medieval authorities apparently interpreted such expressions as acceptable spiritual brotherhood. To John Boswell, in his groundbreaking research, Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality, spent decades analyzing similar documents from monasteries across Europe. What he discovered was a sophisticated code language that allowed monks to express deep emotional and romantic attachments while maintaining plausible deniability about the physical nature of their relationships. The key to this code was the concept of spiritual marriage, a theological framework that allowed same-sex couples to formalize their relationships through religious ceremonies that looked almost identical to heterosexual weddings. Dr. Alan Bray's analysis in the Friend documents dozens of these ceremonies from medieval church records, complete with ring exchanges, vows of eternal faithfulness, and blessings from priests who may or may not have understood what they were actually witnessing. The ceremony between Saint Serge and Bacchus, documented in Byzantine liturgical texts and later adopted in Western monasteries, included vows that are remarkably similar to modern marriage ceremonies. Holy martyrs Serge and Bacchus look favourably upon these your servants, joined together not by nature, but by faith and Holy Spirit. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval same-sex relationships was how they found protection within the very institutions that officially condemned them. The monastery system, designed to remove people from the temptations of the secular world, inadvertently created perfect conditions for same-sex partnerships to develop and flourish. Professor Matthew Kufler's research in the Boswell thesis reveals that medieval monasteries had significantly higher rates of emotional partnership between same-sex individuals than the general population. When you place large numbers of people of the same gender in close quarters, require them to remain celibate with regard to the opposite sex, and create a culture that celebrates intense spiritual friendship, you're essentially designing a system that encourages exactly the relationships that official doctrine condemned. The letters of Abelard and his male correspondents, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, reveal how intellectual partnerships between men often evolved into romantic relationships that were conducted entirely through scholarly discourse. Abelard writes to a fellow philosopher named Bernard, "Your mind illuminates my darkness as no woman's beauty ever could. In your thoughts I find completion that flesh could never provide." Medieval convents created similar opportunities for women, though the evidence is more difficult to trace because women's personal writings were less likely to be preserved in monastic archives. However, Judith Bennett's research into medieval women's communities reveals clear patterns of what she calls passionate friendships that went far beyond normal sisterly affection. The letters of Hildegard of Bingen to her beloved Richardis von Stade, preserved in the Rupertsberger Codex, contain language so emotionally intense that modern scholars have debated for decades whether their relationship was romantic or simply an unusually close friendship. Hildegard writes, "When you left me, the light went out of my life, and I know not how to continue without your dear presence to sustain me." The most dramatic evidence of medieval same-sex relationships comes from an unexpected source. The trial records of the Knights Templar, whose mass arrest in 1307 provides us with detailed testimony about intimate relationships within one of medieval Europe's most powerful military organizations. Dr. Malcolm Barber's comprehensive analysis in The Trial of the Templars reveals that among the many accusations leveled against the order, the charges of immoral relations between brothers were supported by the most detailed and consistent testimony from former members. The confessions, extracted under torture and therefore historically questionable, nevertheless provide remarkable insight into how same-sex relationships functioned within military religious communities. Multiple witnesses described initiation ceremonies that included what they called the kiss of brotherhood, administered to various parts of the body, sleeping arrangements that encouraged physical intimacy, and explicit instructions that brothers should seek comfort with each other rather than with women. Whether these testimonies reflected actual Templar practices or were fabricated by their persecutors remains historically debatable. But Dr. Helen Nicholson's analysis in Love, War and the Grail suggests that the specific details provided by witnesses reflect genuine understanding of how same-sex relationships operated within medieval military communities. The broader historical context supports this interpretation. Medieval armies and military orders created environments where men lived in close quarters for extended periods, formed intense emotional bonds through shared danger, and were actively discouraged from maintaining relationships with women. Under these conditions, romantic and physical relationships between men would have been practically inevitable. The development of what historians call coded languages of affection allowed medieval people to express same-sex attraction while maintaining social safety. Dr. Warren Johansson's research into medieval terminology reveals an elaborate vocabulary of words and phrases that had different meanings depending on context and audience. The term special friend, amicus specialis, appears frequently in medieval correspondence between men and could indicate anything from casual friendship to life partnership, depending on how it was used. Similarly, beloved companion, delectus socius, could refer to travelling partners, business associates or romantic partners, providing perfect cover for relationships that society officially condemned. Women developed similar coded language systems. The phrase "my other self," mea altera pars, appears in letters between medieval women with frequency that suggests it carried specific meaning within female communities. Dr. E. Anne Matter's analysis of medieval women's religious writings in The Voice of My Beloved identifies dozens of such coded terms that allowed women to express intimate attachment while maintaining religious propriety. The artistic and literary production of medieval same-sex communities provides additional evidence of their sophistication and cultural influence. The illuminated manuscripts produced in monasteries known for male partnerships show distinctive artistic styles and thematic content that suggests collaborative creative work between romantic partners. The Très riches Heures du Duc de Berry, created by the Limbourg brothers in the early 15th century, contains imagery and symbolic content that Dr. Michael Camille's analysis in Image on the Edge interprets as coded references to same-sex love within aristocratic court circles. Similarly, the poetry produced in medieval convents includes works by women like Hroswitha of Gandersheim, whose dramatic compositions feature unusually intense relationships between female characters and explore themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and devotion that mirror the language found in documented same-sex correspondence. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval same-sex culture was its intersection with political power at the highest levels of society. Several medieval rulers maintained what were clearly romantic relationships with same-sex partners while fulfilling their official duties as married monarchs. The relationship between Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus of France, documented in contemporary chronicles, went far beyond normal diplomatic friendship. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden writes that the two kings ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. Modern historians debate whether such a description reflect actual romantic relationships or simply different medieval concepts of male friendship. But Dr. John Gillingham's analysis in Richard Pourwain suggests that the specific language used by contemporary chroniclers indicates relationships that went beyond political alliance or conventional friendship. The case of Edward II of England and Piers Gaveston provides even clearer evidence of romantic partnership at the royal level. The contemporary chronicler Vita Edwardi Secundi describes their relationship in terms that leave little doubt about its intimate nature. The king loved Piers above all mortals, showered him with gifts, and could not bear to be parted from him for even a single day. Edward's relationship with Gaveston caused such political turmoil that it contributed to civil war and ultimately Edward's deposition and death. But what's remarkable is that their partnership was initially accepted and even supported by some nobles who saw it as preferable to Edward forming alliances through marriage with foreign powers. Have any of you ever had to hide an important relationship from family or society because you knew they wouldn't understand or approve? Medieval same-sex couples lived with that pressure constantly, developing extraordinary creativity and resilience to maintain connections that brought them joy and fulfillment despite enormous social risks. The religious justifications that medieval same-sex couples developed for their relationships reveal sophisticated theological thinking that challenged official church doctrine while remaining within acceptable bounds of religious discourse. The concept of spiritual marriage allowed couples to argue that their relationship served God's purposes by creating bonds of mutual support and dedication that enhanced rather than interfered with their religious devotion. Some medieval theologians actually supported this interpretation. Peter Abelard's theological writings include passages suggesting that intense same-sex friendship could be spiritually superior to heterosexual marriage because it was based on intellectual and emotional compatibility rather than physical desire or economic necessity. The survival strategies developed by medieval same-sex communities created networks of mutual protection that operated across Europe. Due to R.I. Moore's research in The Formation of a Persecuting Society, documents how individuals facing persecution for same-sex relationships could find refuge in monasteries, courts, or merchant communities where their orientation was quietly accepted. These networks operated through coded correspondence, shared symbols, and carefully maintained reputation systems that allowed people to identify safe spaces and trustworthy allies across vast geographic distances. The sophistication of these networks suggests that medieval same-sex communities were far more organized and extensive than official records indicate. The economic dimensions of medieval same-sex partnerships created interesting complications and opportunities. Since such couples couldn't formalize their relationships through marriage, they developed alternative legal structures for sharing property, providing mutual support, and ensuring inheritance rights. The business partnerships between medieval merchants often included provisions for domestic arrangements that effectively created same-sex households with legal protection. Dr. David Nicholas's research into medieval urban records reveals dozens of such arrangements that provided economic security for couples who couldn't access traditional marriage benefits. The decline of open tolerance for same-sex relationships began in the later medieval period as centralized church and state authority increased, and society became more focused on regulating all forms of sexual behavior. The same institutions that had inadvertently protected same-sex relationships began systematically persecuting them as part of broader efforts to control sexual expression. But the networks, codes, and survival strategies developed during the medieval period persisted in various forms for centuries, providing foundation for later LGBTQ+ communities and rights movements. The courage and creativity shown by medieval same-sex couples in maintaining their relationships despite enormous obstacles offers inspiration and insight that remains relevant today. The most important lesson from medieval same-sex history might be how resilient human love is in the face of social prohibition. When societies try to eliminate forms of love and attraction that they don't understand or approve of, people don't stop loving, they just become more creative about how they express and protect their relationships. But while some medieval people were quietly building hidden communities based on love and mutual support, others were responding to social pressure in dramatically different ways. The mass psychological phenomena we're about to explore shows what happened when entire populations reached their breaking point with the impossible demands that medieval society placed on human behavior. The dancing plague of 1518 was about to sweep across Europe, creating scenes of collective madness that would make everything we've discussed so far seem almost rational by comparison. What happened next in our journey through medieval sexuality reveals what occurs when an entire society reaches its psychological breaking point. All the pressures we've explored, impossible purity standards, brutal marriage regulations, hidden desires, and crushing shame, were about to converge in one of history's most disturbing examples of collective mental breakdown. In July 1518, in the prosperous city of Strasbourg, hundreds of people began dancing uncontrollably in the streets, and they couldn't stop. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, danced until their feet bled, and some danced literally until they died. This wasn't a celebration or a festival, it was mass hysteria on a scale that modern psychologists struggle to comprehend. And the deeper you dig into the historical records, the more you realize that this outbreak of collective madness was directly connected to the sexual and psychological pressures that medieval society had been building for centuries. The dancing plague wasn't an isolated incident, and it wasn't really about dancing at all. It was about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond their psychological limits by social systems that deny basic aspects of human nature. The first documented case appeared on July 14th, 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the narrow street outside her home in Strasbourg and began to dance. According to the Chronicle of Sebastian Brandt, preserved in the Strasbourg City Archives, Trophäa danced alone for 6 straight hours before collapsing from exhaustion. When she regained consciousness, she immediately resumed dancing. Within days, the contagion spread. It's John Waller's comprehensive research in A Time to Dance, A Time to Die reveals that by the end of July, over 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in Strasbourg streets, marketplaces, and even inside churches. City officials, initially amused by what they thought was spontaneous celebration, soon realized they were witnessing something far more sinister. The historical records, preserved in multiple sources, including the Strasbourg Chronicle and the Zimmern Chronicle, describe scenes that sound like something from a horror movie. People danced with bloody feet, their clothes torn, their faces twisted in expressions of terror and ecstasy. They seemed unable to control their movements, yet they also appeared to be experiencing intense pleasure from the dancing. But here's what makes this story particularly relevant to our exploration of medieval sexuality. The demographic analysis of the plague victims reveals patterns that clearly connect the outbreak to sexual and social repression. Dr. Waller's analysis of the historical records shows that the dancing plague disproportionately affected women, particularly young married women and older unmarried women who would have been subject to the most intense sexual regulation and social pressure in medieval society. Of the documented cases, approximately 70% were women, and most were from social classes where church sexual regulations were most strictly enforced. The symptoms described by contemporary observers also suggest connections to sexual frustration and psychological trauma. The chronicler Peter Riff wrote that many dancers exhibited what he called unseemly gyrations and movements that brought shame to modest eyes. Modern readers can recognize these descriptions as suggesting that the uncontrolled dancing often took on sexually suggestive characteristics that scandalize medieval observers. Dr. Robert Bartholomew's analysis in Mass Hysteria in Schools identifies the dancing plague as a classic example of what psychologists call conversion disorder, a condition where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms. When people can't express emotional or sexual needs through normal social channels, their minds sometimes force expression through involuntary physical behavior. The immediate trigger for the Strasbourg outbreak appears to have been a series of particularly harsh sermons about sexual sin delivered by visiting preachers during the summer of 1518. According to records from the Cathedral of Strasbourg, a Franciscan monk named Brother Geiler had spent weeks delivering daily sermons about the dangers of carnal desire, the corruption of the female body, and the necessity of complete sexual purity for salvation. The psychological pressure created by these sermons, combined with the existing sexual repression that we've been exploring throughout our journey, created conditions where mass psychological breakdown became almost inevitable. The case of Maria Siebecken, documented in detail in the Strasbourg City Court records, provides insight into how individual psychology contributed to the collective outbreak. Maria was a 23-year-old married woman whose husband had been travelling on business for over 8 months. During Brother Geiler's sermons, she confessed to having impure thoughts about men other than her husband. Her confessor prescribed severe penance, including extended fasting and nightly vigils of prayer. According to testimony from her neighbours, Maria began showing signs of what we would now recognise as severe anxiety and depression. She stopped eating regularly, avoided contact with other people, and spent hours in what witnesses described as nervous agitation. When Maria joined the dancing plague on July 20th, witnesses reported that she seemed transformed. The anxious, withdrawn woman became vibrant and energetic, dancing with an enthusiasm that seemed to release months of pent-up tension and frustration. But the psychological relief came at a terrible cost. Maria danced for 4 days straight, pausing only when she collapsed from exhaustion. She died on the 5th day, and her final words, according to court testimony, were expressions of gratitude for the first happiness she'd experienced since her marriage. The religious authorities' response to the dancing plague reveals how completely medieval institutions misunderstood the psychological crisis they had created. Rather than recognizing the outbreak as a symptom of excessive sexual repression, church leaders interpreted it as evidence that Strasbourg had become contaminated by demonic influence, requiring even more strict moral regulation. Cardinal Matthias Lang, in his official report to Rome, wrote that the dancing plague was divine punishment for the city's tolerance of carnal pleasures and recommended increased enforcement of sexual purity laws as the appropriate response. The city council, following church guidance, initially tried to cure the plague by encouraging more dancing. They hired musicians and built stages, believing that allowing the dancers to exhaust themselves completely would end the outbreak. This spectacularly wrong treatment made the situation much worse, as documented in the detailed accounts of city physician Dr. Paracelsus, who witnessed the events firsthand. Paracelsus's medical notes, preserved in the University of Basel archives, provide the most detailed contemporary analysis of the plague's symptoms and progression. He observed that victims seemed to be in trance-like states where they lost normal social inhibitions and behaved in ways that would normally be considered scandalous. He wrote, "The afflicted appear to experience profound rapture, as if released from bonds that normally constrain human behavior. They speak freely of desires they would normally conceal, touch others in ways that would normally bring shame, and move their bodies in manners that suggest the release of long-suppressed natural impulses." Modern psychiatric analysis of Paracelsus's descriptions suggests that the dancers were experiencing what psychologists call dissociative episodes triggered by severe psychological stress. The dancing became a way for their minds to escape unbearable psychological pressure by temporarily abandoning normal consciousness. The sexual undertones of the dancing plague weren't lost on contemporary observers, though they struggled to understand what they were witnessing. The Chronicle of Johannes Wimferling describes scenes where dancers would embrace strangers, make inappropriate advances, and engage in behavior that he could only describe as possessed by spirits of lust. What Wimferling was actually observing was probably the temporary breakdown of sexual inhibitions that had been artificially intensified by religious and social pressure. When normal psychological controls collapsed during dissociative episodes, people's natural sexual impulses emerged in exaggerated and inappropriate ways. The plague spread pattern also suggests connections to sexual and social networks. Dr. Waller's analysis shows that the contagion spread most rapidly among people who shared similar social pressures: young married women, older unmarried women, and men who'd been recently disciplined by church authorities for sexual transgressions. The most disturbing aspect of the dancing plague was how it revealed the complete failure of medieval society's approach to human psychology. Instead of recognizing that their sexual regulations were creating mental health crises, religious and civil authorities doubled down on the very policies that had caused the outbreak. Have any of you ever felt so overwhelmed by social expectations or personal pressure that you thought you might just lose control completely? The dancing plague represents what happened when entire communities reached that breaking point simultaneously. The outbreak finally ended not through religious intervention or medical treatment, but through exhaustion and death. By September 1518, most of the dancers had either died from exhaustion, been physically restrained by their families, or simply collapsed and gradually returned to normal consciousness. But the psychological damage to Strasbourg's community was lasting. Dr. Hartmut Lehmann's research into post-plague Strasbourg reveals increased rates of what medieval sources describe as melancholy, nervous disorders, and spiritual despair that persisted for decades after the dancing ended. The dancing plague wasn't unique to Strasbourg. Similar outbreaks occurred across Europe during periods of intense social and religious pressure. Dr. Robert E. Bartholomew documented over 30 similar episodes between 1374 and 1578, almost all occurring in regions where church sexual regulations were most strictly enforced. The Aachen dancing plague of 1374, the Erfurt outbreak of 1518, and the Basel incident of 1536 all followed similar patterns. They began during periods of intensified preaching about sexual sin, disproportionately affected women and sexually marginalized men, and included behavior that contemporary observers described in language suggesting sexual overtones. Modern understanding of mass hysteria helps explain how sexual repression could trigger collective psychological breakdown. When societies create impossible standards for human behavior, individuals experience chronic psychological stress. When enough people in a community share similar stress, conditions become ripe for collective expressions of that psychological pressure. The dancing plagues represent one of the most extreme examples in history of how sexual repression can manifest as collective mental health crisis. But they also reveal something hopeful about human resilience. Even under the most oppressive social conditions, people find ways to express their authentic selves, even if those expressions take forms that seem bizarre or destructive. Dr. Carol Tavris's research into historical mass hysteria suggests that outbreaks like the dancing plague served unconscious psychological functions for communities under severe social stress. They provided temporary release from impossible social pressures and created spaces where people could express suppressed aspects of their personality without individual responsibility. The economic impact of the dancing plague on Strasbourg was substantial. Trade disrupted, businesses closed, and the city's reputation for stability and prosperity was severely damaged. The outbreak demonstrated how sexual and psychological repression could have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond individual mental health. The most tragic aspect of the dancing plague was how preventable it was. If medieval authorities had recognized that their sexual regulations were creating psychological pressure beyond what most people could bear, they could have adjusted their policies to prevent collective breakdown. Instead, the response to each outbreak was typically to increase the very pressures that had caused the crisis in the first place. Church authorities interpreted mass hysteria as evidence that they needed to be even more strict about sexual regulation, creating conditions for future outbreaks. The legacy of the medieval dancing plagues extends into modern times in ways that might surprise you. Contemporary research into mass hysteria, social contagion, and collective behavior all trace back to studies of these medieval outbreaks. Understanding how sexual repression contributed to collective psychological breakdown has informed modern approaches to public health, education, and social policy. But perhaps the most important lesson from the dancing plagues is the demonstration of how powerfully human psychology responds to social pressure. When societies create standards that ignore basic human needs and impulses, individuals don't simply comply. They find ways to express those suppressed needs, sometimes in ways that are destructive to themselves and their communities. The dancing plague also reveals how closely connected sexual health and mental health were in medieval society, just as they are today. The same social pressures that created impossible sexual standards also created conditions for psychological breakdown, demonstrating that healthy societies must find ways to acknowledge and accommodate the full range of human experience. Looking back at these medieval outbreaks of collective madness, we can see how they were simultaneously symptoms of social failure and expressions of human resilience. Even under the most oppressive conditions, people found ways to break free from impossible constraints, even if that freedom was temporary and came at enormous cost. But while the dancing plague revealed the devastating effects of sexual repression on collective mental health, it also exposed the complete inadequacy of medieval medical understanding when it came to treating the human consequences of social pressure. The physicians and healers of the time were about to demonstrate just how dangerous it could be when medical authority combined with profound ignorance about human psychology and sexuality to create treatment approaches that were often more harmful than the conditions they claimed to cure. In the aftermath of collective breakdowns like the dancing plague, medieval society desperately needed medical solutions to help people cope with the psychological and physical damage caused by centuries of sexual repression. Unfortunately, they turned to physicians whose understanding of human sexuality was so fundamentally wrong that their treatments were often more dangerous than the conditions they claimed to cure. Medieval medicine had developed elaborate theories about how sexual activity could cure diseases, prevent aging, and even change your personality. And these theories led to medical prescriptions that would make modern doctors call emergency ethics committees. What medieval physicians created wasn't just bad medicine, it was a parallel universe of medical thinking, where sexual activity became a pharmaceutical tool prescribed with the same confidence that modern doctors prescribe antibiotics, and with results that were sometimes miraculous, often useless, and occasionally fatal. The foundation of medieval medical sexuality was the ancient theory of the four humours, which medieval physicians had inherited from Greek medicine and then twisted into something that would have horrified Hippocrates himself. Danielle Jacquard, in her comprehensive study Medieval Medicine and Natural History, reveals how medieval doctors transformed classical medical theory into a system that treated sexual activity as a precise medical intervention with predictable therapeutic effects. According to medieval medical theory, documented in texts like the Liber de Cortu by Constantine the African, every human body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health required these humours to be in perfect balance, and disease occurred when any humour became excessive or deficient. What made this relevant to sexuality was the medieval belief that sexual activity directly affected humoral balance in ways that could cure specific illnesses. Let me introduce you to Master Johannes de Sancto Paulo, a 13th century physician whose case notes, preserved in the archives of the University of Salerno, provide the most detailed surviving record of medieval sexual medicine in practice. Johannes wasn't some backwoods healer. He was a university-trained physician with an international reputation who treated nobility and wealthy merchants across Europe. Johannes's patient rowers reveal a medical practice that would seem like science fiction if it weren't so thoroughly documented. For patients suffering from what we now recognize as depression, Johannes prescribed specific sexual positions performed at particular times of day to rebalance melancholic humours. For anxiety disorders, he recommended controlled schedules of sexual activity designed to disperse excessive choleric vapours. His most detailed case involves treating Count Arnaud de Serval for what Johannes diagnosed as an excess of sanguine humours causing violent temperament and poor judgment in battle. The prescription, recorded in medieval Latin that required scholarly translation, involved a complex regimen of sexual positions, dietary modifications, and bloodletting designed to reduce the Count's blood levels and make him a more effective military commander. Dr. Monitor Green's analysis in Making Women's Medicine Masculine reveals that Johannes's approach was typical of medieval medical practice. Physicians routinely prescribed sexual activity as treatment for conditions ranging from headaches to infertility to what they called spiritual melancholy. But the most fascinating aspect of medieval sexual medicine was the belief that sexual energy could be transferred between partners to treat age-related decline. The theory, preserved in texts like the De Retardandis Senectutis Accidentibus by Roger Bacon, held that young people possessed excess vital energy that could be absorbed by older partners through intimate contact. This led to medical prescriptions that modern ethics committees would find appalling. Elderly, wealthy patients were often prescribed sexual relationships with much younger partners as a form of anti-aging therapy. The age differences involved weren't just socially problematic, they were based on mathematical calculations about optimal energy transfer that treated human beings like medical equipment. The case of Lord Geoffrey de Montfort, documented in the Chronicles of Matthew Paris, provides a disturbing example of how this theory worked in practice. Geoffrey, age 7, and suffering from what medieval physicians diagnosed as diminished vital spirits, was prescribed regular sexual contact with women under the age of 20 as a treatment for his declining health. The prescription was written with the same clinical precision that modern doctors use for medication dosages. Geoffrey was instructed to engage in intimate relations exactly 3 times per week, always in the morning when young people's vital energy was supposedly strongest, and to avoid climax more than once per month to prevent excessive depletion of restored humours. Geoffrey's physician, Master William of Salicito, kept detailed records of the treatment's effects, preserved in the British Library's collection of medieval medical texts. According to William's notes, Geoffrey did show initial improvement in energy levels and mental clarity, though modern medical understanding suggests this was likely due to increased physical activity and social interaction, rather than mystical energy transfer. The treatment continued for 2 years until Geoffrey died in what the physician's notes describe as a state of restored youthful vigour. Modern historians have noted that the young women involved in this medical treatment had no choice in the matter and received no compensation beyond room and board, essentially making them unpaid medical assistants in a therapy that existed primarily for the benefit of wealthy elderly men. Medieval physicians also developed elaborate theories about how specific sexual positions could cure different diseases by directing bodily humours to appropriate organs. Dr. Joan Cadden's research in Meanings of Sex Difference in the Middle Ages reveals medical texts that prescribe different positions for treating everything from kidney stones to respiratory infections. The Speculum Alfodri, by the Spanish physician Arnaud de Villanova, contains detailed illustrations of sexual positions prescribed for specific medical conditions. For patients with digestive problems, Arnaud recommended positions that would encourage the flow of bilious humours toward the stomach. For respiratory ailments, he prescribed positions designed to direct vital spirits toward the lungs and heart. These weren't vague suggestions. They were precise medical instructions, complete with timing, frequency, and anatomical explanations that medieval physicians defended with the same confidence that modern doctors discuss pharmaceutical interventions. Have any of you ever received medical advice that seemed so bizarre you wondered if your doctor had lost their mind? Medieval patients regularly received sexual prescriptions that were based on medical theories so wrong that they seem like parody. Yet these treatments were prescribed by the most educated physicians of their time, using the best medical knowledge available. The most dangerous aspect of medieval sexual medicine involved treatments that combined intimate activity with other medical interventions like bloodletting, purging, and the administration of toxic substances. Medieval physicians believed that sexual arousal enhanced the body's ability to absorb medicines and expel disease, leading to combination therapies that were often deadly. The case of Lady Isabella de Clare, documented in the medical records of the Abbey of Fontevraud, illustrates how dangerous these combination treatments could be. Isabella, suffering from what medieval physicians diagnosed as wandering womb, probably endometriosis, was prescribed a treatment regimen that combined sexual activity with regular doses of mercury and antimony. The treatment protocol, preserved in the Abbey's medical manuscripts, required Isabella to engage in intimate relations immediately before and after, consuming toxic substances, based on the theory that sexual arousal would help her body process the medicines more effectively and direct their healing properties to the appropriate organs. Isabella died after 3 months of this treatment, though her physician attributed her death to insufficient compliance with prescribed intimate activities rather than mercury poisoning. The physician's notes suggest that he increased the dosages of toxic substances when Isabella became too ill to participate in the sexual aspects of her treatment, creating a deadly cycle where medication poisoning was treated with more medication. The belief that sexual activity could transfer personality traits between partners led to some of medieval medicine's most bizarre prescriptions. To Ruth Marzo-Karas's research into medieval medical manuscripts reveals treatments designed to alter patients' temperaments by exposing them to partners with desired characteristics. Men considered too aggressive were prescribed intimate relationships with women known for gentleness and patience. Women deemed insufficiently assertive were encouraged to seek relationships with partners known for strong leadership qualities. The theory held that prolonged intimate contact would gradually transfer personality traits through the same humoral mechanisms that supposedly transferred vital energy. Master Albertus Magnus, in his treatise De Secretis Mulierum, provided detailed instructions for using sexual contact to modify personality traits. He claimed that specific types of intimate contact could make cowardly men brave, transform melancholic individuals into cheerful ones, and even increase intelligence through exposure to intellectually superior partners. These personality transfer treatments created a medieval market in what we might call therapeutic partnerships, where people with desired traits could earn money by providing intimate contact to patients seeking personality modification. The ethical implications were staggering, and the lack of any scientific basis for these treatments meant that desperate patients often spent fortunes on interventions that had no effect beyond temporary mood changes. Medieval medicine also developed elaborate theories about the relationship between sexual satisfaction and physical health that led to prescriptions for specific types and frequencies of intimate activity based on patients' medical needs. Dr. Danielle Jacquart's analysis of medieval gynecological texts reveals detailed recommendations for sexual practices designed to treat everything from infertility to mental illness. The Trotula, a collection of medieval women's medical texts preserved in multiple manuscript traditions, contains specific prescriptions for intimate activities designed to treat reproductive health problems. The recommendations are surprisingly sophisticated in some ways, recognizing connections between emotional satisfaction and physical health that modern medicine has validated. But the treatments were also based on anatomical misconceptions so fundamental that they sometimes caused more harm than good. Medieval physicians believed that female reproductive health required regular uterine massage through intimate contact, leading to prescriptions for sexual activity that ignored women's actual physical needs and comfort. The economic dimensions of medieval sexual medicine created opportunities for fraud and exploitation that would make modern medical scam artists jealous. Wealthy patients, desperate for health improvements, would pay enormous sums for sexual treatments that had no basis in medical science, but were promoted by physicians with impressive credentials and elaborate theoretical justifications. The business records of Master Robert de Ketton, preserved in the York Minster archives, show that he earned more money from prescribing sexual treatments than from all his other medical services combined. Robert specialized in treating wealthy elderly patients with anti-aging sexual therapies that required expensive young partners, luxury accommodations, and months of supervised treatment. Robert's success attracted imitators across Europe who developed their own versions of sexual medicine, creating a competitive market in treatments that ranged from harmlessly ineffective to dangerously toxic. Some practitioners combined sexual prescriptions with legitimate medical interventions, making it difficult for patients to determine which aspects of their treatment were actually helping. The psychological impact of medieval sexual medicine on both practitioners and patients was profound. Physicians found themselves in the bizarre position of prescribing the most intimate human experiences as if they were pharmaceutical compounds, while patients struggled to understand how activities they had been taught were sinful could suddenly become medical necessities. Dr. Peter Biller's research into medieval confession manuals reveals the theological complications created when sexual activity was prescribed as medical treatment. Priests struggled to determine whether medically prescribed intimate relations constituted sin, leading to complex theological debates about the spiritual implications of sexual medicine. Some religious authorities developed the position that sexual activity was only sinful when pursued for pleasure rather than health, creating a distinction between medical sex and recreational sex that patients were expected to maintain psychologically during intimate encounters. The mental gymnastics required to engage in sexual activity while avoiding pleasure created additional psychological stress for people already dealing with serious health problems. The decline of medieval sexual medicine came gradually as Renaissance physicians began questioning the theoretical foundations of humoral theory and demanding empirical evidence for medical treatments. The rise of anatomical study based on human dissection revealed that many medieval assumptions about how the body worked were simply wrong. But the legacy of medieval sexual medicine persisted in various forms for centuries. Dr. Roy Porter's research in The Greatest Benefit to Mankind shows that some medieval sexual treatments continued to be prescribed by physicians well into the 18th century, and that folk medical traditions preserved many medieval beliefs about the therapeutic value of sexual activity. The most important lesson from medieval sexual medicine might be how easily medical authority can be used to justify practices that serve the interests of practitioners and patients' desires rather than actual health needs. When physicians have the power to prescribe intimate human relationships as medical treatments, the potential for exploitation and abuse becomes enormous. Understanding how medieval medicine approached sexuality also reveals how medical and social attitude towards sex have always been intertwined in complex ways. The same society that condemned sexual pleasure as sinful was simultaneously developing elaborate medical theories about the therapeutic value of sexual activity, creating contradictions that patients and practitioners struggled to navigate. But medieval sexual medicine also demonstrates something hopeful about human nature. Even when medical treatments were based on completely wrong theories, the human connections formed during treatment sometimes provided genuine emotional and physical benefits that transcended the uselessness of the underlying medical science. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval sexual practices, we've seen how a civilization's attempts to control, regulate, and medicalize human sexuality created a legacy that still influences us today. The story of how these bizarre medieval practices evolved into modern attitudes towards sex, relationships, and personal freedom reveals connections between past and present that might surprise you. Our final chapter explores how the sexual revolution of the 1960s, contemporary dating culture, and even modern medical approaches to sexuality all trace their roots back to the medieval experiments in human control that we've been exploring together. After travelling through centuries of bizarre medieval sexual practices, from church-controlled bedrooms to dancing plagues to medical prescriptions for personality-changing sex, you might think we've left all that medieval madness safely in the distant past. But here's the truth that will change how you see modern America forever. We haven't escaped medieval sexual culture at all. We've simply repackaged it, modernized it, and convinced ourselves we've moved beyond it, while the fundamental patterns, anxieties, and contradictions that defined medieval sexuality continue to shape American culture in ways that most people never recognize. The thread connecting a 12th century penitential manual to a modern purity culture seminar, or linking Eleanor of Aquitaine's Courts of Love to contemporary romance novels, reveals that human societies have been wrestling with the same basic tensions around sexuality, control, and freedom for over 1,000 years. Let me show you exactly how the medieval sexual experiments we've explored together became the foundation for attitudes and practices that influence American life right now, in ways that will make you see everything from dating apps to political debates to medical care in completely new ways. The most direct connection between medieval and modern American sexual culture came through the Puritan colonists, who weren't really trying to escape European sexual regulation, they were trying to perfect it. Dr. Edmund Morgan's groundbreaking research in Puritan family reveals how the Massachusetts Bay Colony essentially functioned as a laboratory for implementing medieval church sexual regulations more completely than had ever been possible in Europe. The Puritan colonies adopted medieval penitential practices, confession requirements, and even some of the detailed bedroom regulations that we explored in our first chapter. But they also innovated, creating new forms of sexual surveillance and control that combined medieval religious authority with emerging concepts of civil law enforcement. The 1642 Massachusetts Body of Liberties, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, includes sexual regulations that are directly traceable to medieval canonical law. The provisions for investigating adultery, regulating courtship, and punishing sexual deviance use language and concepts that come straight from medieval church law, adapted for a colonial legal system that had more practical power to enforce such regulations than medieval authorities had ever possessed. But the Puritans' most lasting contribution to American sexual culture wasn't their legal codes. It was their psychological approach to sexuality that combined medieval shame-based thinking with emerging Protestant concepts of individual moral responsibility. Dr. Richard Godbeer's analysis in Sexual Revolution in Early America demonstrates how Puritan sexual culture created what he calls internalized moral surveillance, the psychological mechanisms that made external sexual regulation unnecessary because individuals had been trained to regulate their own desires according to impossible standards. This internalized regulation system, developed in 17th century New England, became the foundation for American sexual culture patterns that persist today. The combination of sexual shame, individual responsibility for moral purity, and the belief that sexual desire itself indicates spiritual or psychological weakness can be traced directly from medieval penitential practices through Puritan psychology to contemporary American attitudes. Modern American purity culture movements, analyzed by Dr. Christine Gardner in Making Chastity Sexy, use rhetoric, practices, and psychological techniques that are remarkably similar to medieval virginity cult practices we explored earlier. Purity rings, virginity pledges, and elaborate courtship rules represent direct evolutionary descendants of medieval approaches to sexual control. The economic dimensions of American sexual regulation also trace back to medieval patterns. Dr. Viviana Zelizer's research in Purchase of Intimacy reveals how American prostitution laws, sex work regulations, and even contemporary debates about sex trafficking use legal frameworks and moral arguments that come directly from medieval church approaches to commercial sexuality. The Mann Act of 1910, which criminalized transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes, used language and legal concepts that can be traced back to medieval church law about sexual commerce. American legal approaches to sex work have consistently reflected the same fundamental contradiction we saw in medieval church policy, simultaneously condemning and profiting from sexual commerce while creating systems that harm the people actually involved in such work. But perhaps the most fascinating connection between medieval and modern American sexual culture involves the concept of romantic love itself. The courtly love traditions we explored, with their emphasis on idealized, unattainable romantic objects and the belief that true love involves suffering and sacrifice, became foundational to American romantic culture through literary and cultural transmission. Dr. Denis de Rougemont's analysis in Love in the Western World traces how medieval courtly love concepts traveled through European literature, influenced by the writers like Shakespeare and the Romantic poets, and eventually became embedded in American popular culture through novels, films, and music. The American dating culture patterns that seem most natural to us, the belief that romantic relationships should be based on passionate attraction, the idea that love should involve emotional intensity and dramatic obstacles, the expectation that romantic partners should be both sexually alluring and morally pure, all trace back to medieval courtly love traditions. Contemporary American romance novels, analysed by Dr. Pamela Regis in A Natural History of the Romance Novel, use plot structures, character types, and emotional patterns that come directly from medieval courtly romance literature. The tension between desire and propriety, the emphasis on male pursuit and female resistance, and the ultimate resolution through marriage all reflect medieval courtly love conventions. Even modern American marriage culture reflects medieval patterns in ways that might surprise you. Dr. Stephanie Kuntz's comprehensive research in Marriage: A History shows how American approaches to marriage selection, wedding ceremonies, and expectations about marital roles combine medieval Christian marriage theology with courtly love romanticism and Puritan moral psychology. The American expectation that marriages should be based on romantic love while also serving as economic partnerships, providing emotional support, maintaining sexual satisfaction, and creating stable child-rearing environments represents an attempt to combine medieval marriage functions that were historically kept separate. This creates what Dr. Eli Finkel calls the all-or-nothing marriage in contemporary American culture relationships that are expected to fulfill every possible human need while maintaining the moral purity, romantic intensity, and practical stability that medieval culture had divided among different types of relationships. The psychological pressures created by these impossible expectations help explain why American divorce rates, relationship anxiety, and sexual dysfunction rates are so high compared to cultures with more realistic approaches to human partnerships. But the medieval legacy in American culture extends beyond marriage and dating to influence contemporary political and social debates in ways that most participants don't recognize. The rhetoric used in American culture war debates about sexuality, gender roles, and reproductive rights employs arguments and emotional appeals that come directly from medieval theological and legal traditions. Dr. R. Marie Griffith's analysis in Moral Combat reveals how contemporary American political debates about abortion, contraception, and LGBT+ rights use theological frameworks, legal concepts, and moral arguments that medieval church authorities developed centuries ago. The belief that sexual regulation is necessary for social stability, the argument that individual sexual choices have collective moral consequences, and the conviction that government should enforce particular sexual standards all reflect medieval approaches to sexuality and social control. Even secular American approaches to sexuality often reflect medieval patterns. The medical establishment's historical approaches to sexual disorders, the psychiatric profession's treatment of sexual variation, and contemporary therapeutic approaches to sexual problems all show influences from medieval medical traditions we explored earlier. Dr. Eli Coleman's research in Sexual Health for the Millennium documents how American medical approaches to sexuality have consistently reflected moral and social assumptions rather than purely scientific evidence, continuing patterns that began with medieval sexual medicine. The contemporary American emphasis on sexual performance, the belief that sexual activity should serve health and wellness goals, and the medicalization of normal sexual variation all represent evolutionary developments of medieval approaches to sexual medicine. But understanding these historical connections also reveals opportunities for positive change. Recognizing how medieval sexual culture influences contemporary American attitudes allows us to question which inherited patterns serve human well-being and which create unnecessary suffering. The medieval examples of resistance, creativity, and alternative community building that we've explored throughout our journey provide inspiration for contemporary people seeking healthier approaches to sexuality, relationships, and personal freedom. The medieval women who developed sophisticated contraceptive knowledge, the couples who found ways to build loving relationships within oppressive social systems, and the communities that quietly supported people who couldn't conform to impossible standards all demonstrate that human creativity and resilience can flourish even under the most difficult circumstances. Have any of you noticed connections between the medieval patterns we've explored and your own experiences with modern dating culture, family expectations, or social pressure around relationships? The threads connecting past and present are everywhere once you learn to recognize them. Modern Americans who feel trapped between unrealistic expectations about romantic love, sexual performance, and moral purity are experiencing pressures that medieval people would have immediately recognized. But we also have opportunities for understanding, choice, and community support that medieval people could never have imagined. The most hopeful aspect of this historical perspective is recognizing that the sexual attitudes and practices that seem most natural or traditional in American culture are actually relatively recent historical developments that can be changed when they no longer serve human flourishing. Understanding how medieval sexual culture evolved into contemporary American patterns doesn't require us to accept those patterns as inevitable or unchangeable. Instead, it provides perspective on how human societies have always negotiated the tensions between individual desire and social stability, personal freedom and collective responsibility. The medieval period's most important lesson for contemporary Americans might be the demonstration that societies can survive and even thrive while accommodating much greater diversity in sexual expression, relationship structures, and personal choices than our current culture often allows. Medieval people, despite living under what seemed like incredibly oppressive social systems, found ways to create meaningful relationships, build supportive communities, and express their authentic selves. Their creativity and resilience in the face of seemingly impossible social constraints offers both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary people facing their own relationship challenges. Looking back at this remarkable journey we've taken together, from church-controlled bedrooms to secret same-sex ceremonies, from royal incest to peasant contraception, from collective madness to medical malpractice, reveals the extraordinary complexity and resilience of human sexuality across cultures and centuries. Every bizarre medieval practice we've explored represents people just like us, trying to navigate the eternal tensions between desire and social expectation, individual fulfillment and collective stability, love and power, their successes and failures, their creativity and their tragedies, all offer insights that remain relevant for anyone trying to build authentic, fulfilling relationships in any era. The thread connecting a medieval monastery's secret love letters to a modern couple's text messages, linking a 13th century woman's contraceptive herbs to contemporary reproductive choices, tying medieval courtly love poetry to today's dating apps, reveals that the fundamental questions about sexuality, relationships and human connection remain remarkably constant across time. What changes are the social systems, legal frameworks and cultural narratives that shape how we answer those eternal questions? Understanding this history empowers us to make more conscious choices about which inherited patterns we want to preserve and which we're ready to change. As we conclude this exploration of medieval sexual culture and its lasting influence on American society, I hope you've discovered not just fascinating historical stories, but new perspectives on contemporary questions about love, relationships, sexuality, and personal freedom that affect all of our lives. The medieval world's greatest gift to contemporary Americans might be the reminder that human creativity, resilience, and capacity for love have always found ways to flourish, even under the most challenging circumstances. Their stories encourage us to approach our own relationship challenges with greater wisdom, compassion, and hope. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable journey through the hidden corners of medieval life and their unexpected connections to our modern world. The courage you've shown in exploring these complex and sometimes difficult historical realities reflects the same curiosity and openness that allowed our medieval ancestors to navigate their own challenging times. I hope tonight's exploration has given you not just entertainment, but genuine insights that will enrich your understanding of both the past and the present. The stories we've shared represent just a small sampling of the countless fascinating, surprising, and deeply human tales that history has to offer. Keep that sense of wonder alive, and I'll see you again soon for another journey into the remarkable stories that connect us across centuries. Until then, sweet dreams, and remember, no matter how strange the modern world might seem sometimes, people have been figuring out how to love, connect, and build meaningful lives together for thousands of years. We're all part of that continuing story. Sleep well, and thank you for being such wonderful companions on this adventure through time.